Africa's unfinished business. The Western role in the underdevelopment, instability, and economic woes of Africa. Authored by Dr. Basil Chudi Nwolisa. Preface. Africa's story is one of brilliance dimmed, of hope betrayed, yet of resilience that refuses to die. This book, Africa's Unfinished Business, was born out of a deep burden, a cry against the chains of underdevelopment, the orchestrated instabilities, and the economic woes that have lingered far too long on our beloved continent. As I trace the footprints of history, from the Berlin Conference to the boardrooms of oil multinationals, from the cries of Biafra to the silence of neglected villages in the Niger Delta, I was confronted with one unshakable truth: Africa's poverty is not natural. It is designed, sustained, and perpetuated by powers both within and without. Yet this work is not merely a lament. It is also a call to awareness, to courage, and to action. It is my humble attempt to unmask the role of the great world powers in Africa's struggles, while challenging us, Africans, to rise above timidity and reclaim the dignity of self-determination. I stand on the shoulders of giants whose wisdom strengthens these pages: Louis Farrakhan's fiery defense of black destiny, Chinua Achebe's piercing critique of failed leadership, Nnamdi Kolu's cry for self-determination, Cyprian Ekwensi's chronicling of our lived realities, and countless other voices that refuse to be silenced. This book does not pretend to have all the answers, but it seeks to awaken questions, stir reflections, and ignite determination in the hearts of readers. For the future of our children, for the memory of those who resisted oppression, and for the honor of Africa herself, we must complete the unfinished business. Forward. By Mrs. Odega Franciscae. Africa has been described by many names: the cradle of civilization, the land of promise, and also, tragically, the theater of exploitation. Our story, both majestic and painful, has too often been written by others, interpreted through foreign lenses, and distorted to justify domination. The time has come for us to reclaim our narrative and speak with our own voice. In this work, Africa's Unfinished Business, Dr. Basil Chudi Nwolisa brings to light the uncomfortable yet undeniable truth that the underdevelopment, instability, and economic hardship of Africa are neither accidental nor natural. They are the product of deliberate policies, foreign manipulations, and the complicity of local actors who have betrayed their people. With clarity and courage, he exposes the orchestrations of great world powers in Africa's affairs, from the exploitation of Nigeria's resources to the promotion of weak and corrupt leaders. What sets this book apart is not only its piercing analysis but also its deeply human vision. Dr. Nwolisa writes as a son of Africa, as a father who dreams of a better tomorrow for his children, and as a patriot whose heart beats for justice. He draws inspiration from the timeless voices of Louis Farrakhan, Chinua Achebe, Nnamdi Kolu, Cyprian Ekwensi, and many others, weaving their wisdom into a narrative that both educates and empowers. This book is not merely a historical reflection, it is a call to conscience. It challenges us to recognize the unfinished tasks before us, to dismantle the structures of exploitation, to confront corruption, to cultivate true leadership, and to unite as Africans in purpose and destiny. It is my honor to commend this work to you. May it awaken your mind, stir your spirit, and inspire your hands to labor for the Africa we all long to see, an Africa free, strong, and prosperous. Introduction. Africa is a paradox. It is the richest continent in natural resources, yet home to some of the poorest people on earth. It gave birth to civilizations that taught the world mathematics, medicine, and philosophy, yet it is constantly portrayed as backward and dependent. From the banks of the Nile to the oil-rich creeks of the Niger Delta, Africa has been both a treasure chest and a battlefield, plundered by outsiders, betrayed by insiders, and left struggling with the heavy weight of history. The phrase, Africa's Unfinished Business, is more than a title. It is a metaphor for the interrupted journey of a continent that once held the promise of greatness but was diverted by colonial conquest, imperial exploitation, and neo-colonial manipulation. It is a reminder that political independence alone was never enough, that the liberation of our minds, economies, and leadership remains a task unfinished. This book emerges from the burden of truth, the truth that Africa's underdevelopment, instability, and economic woes are not accidents of nature, nor the result of some supposed inferiority of our people. They are deliberate outcomes of centuries of exploitation, orchestrated by great world powers that continue to benefit from Africa's pain. From the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85, where European powers carved Africa into artificial states, to the modern boardrooms of multinational corporations and financial institutions, Africa has been trapped in a cycle designed to enrich others while impoverishing her. The role of the West in this tragedy cannot be ignored. Through colonial conquest, Africa's resources were plundered to build foreign empires. Through military interventions and the sponsorship of coups, visionary leaders who dared to dream of true independence, Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, were eliminated or undermined. Through economic policies imposed by the IMF and World Bank, African nations were tied into debt dependency. And through the strategic orchestration of insecurity, the continent has been kept in a state of chaos that makes genuine development almost impossible. But exploitation has not come from outsiders alone. Within Africa herself, collaborators and opportunists have raised leaders who traded national dignity for personal gain, rulers who served as puppets to foreign masters, and elites who enriched themselves while their people starved. As Chinua Achebe once wrote in The Trouble with Nigeria, the problem is not so much the land or its people, but the failure of leadership. Nigeria, Africa's giant, stands as both a symbol of hope and a mirror of betrayal. Blessed with oil, fertile land, and human capital, it should have been a beacon of prosperity. Yet it has become an example of squandered wealth, political instability, and orchestrated insecurity. From the Biafra War to the Niger Delta crisis, from decades of military coups to the rise of terrorism, Nigeria's story reflects the wider African condition, a nation trapped between promise and peril, exploited by external powers while sabotaged by internal weakness. The unfinished business of Africa, therefore, is not only about economic development but about the restoration of dignity, sovereignty, and self-determination. It is about exposing the hidden hands that profit from Africa's chaos while empowering Africans to reclaim their destiny. It is about refusing to allow timid criminals to be dressed as leaders, and about demanding accountability, vision, and integrity in governance. This book draws inspiration from the voices of those who refuse to be silent: Louis Farrakhan, who reminded us of the global nature of black struggle; Chinua Achebe, who warned of the consequences of failed leadership; Nnamdi Kanu, who continues to raise the cry of self-determination; Cyprian Ekwensi, who captured the cultural heartbeat of our people; and many others who, in different ways, have kept alive the flame of resistance and hope. The chapters that follow will explore Africa's past, confront its present, and imagine its future. We will revisit the colonial blueprint of exploitation, examine the orchestrated instability that keeps Africa weak, and confront the uncomfortable truth of local betrayal. We will focus on Nigeria as a case study of both Africa's wealth and its wounds. And finally, we will look toward a future where Africa can rise, not as a pawn in the games of great powers, but as a continent united, self-reliant, and dignified. This is not a book of despair. It is a book of awakening. It is a call to conscience, to courage, and to responsibility. Africa's unfinished business is our collective business. It is the work of governments, intellectuals, artists, faith leaders, and above all, the youth who refuse to inherit chains. If Africa is to complete her journey, she must first confront her history with honesty, understand her present with clarity, and pursue her future with unity and determination. That is the purpose of this book, and it is my prayer that these words will not only inform but also inspire, that they will spark conversations, ignite action, and keep alive the hope of a liberated Africa. Part 1. Historical Foundations of Africa's Underdevelopment. The story of Africa's underdevelopment is neither accidental nor self-inflicted alone. It is a carefully orchestrated historical process engineered by global powers with vested interests. From the first contact with Europe during the transatlantic slave trade to the era of colonialism and now neocolonial manipulations, Africa has remained entangled in a web of exploitation, insecurity, and systemic stagnation. The great powers, under the guise of civilization, democracy, and globalization, have perpetuated a vicious cycle of dependency that continues to cripple the continent's growth. As Louis Farrakhan once declared, the enslavement of Africans and the colonization of Africa is the greatest crime ever committed against the people. Farrakhan, 1997. This crime was not merely about the forced exploitation of human labor or the seizure of land, but about the deliberate destruction of indigenous systems that sustained African societies for centuries. The slave trade, Africa's first global economic sabotage. The transatlantic slave trade was not simply a trade in humans, it was the foundation of Europe's industrial prosperity. Walter Rodney in his classic work How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, 1972, demonstrated that Europe's wealth was built upon African exploitation. Millions of Africans, the productive class, were stolen and shipped to the Americas, leaving behind fractured families, depopulated societies, and weakened economies. Chinua Achebe reminds us in There Was a Country, 2012, that slavery not only devastated Africa but also distorted its political institutions. The brutal transatlantic slave trade robbed Africa of its human capital and corroded its cultural institutions, setting the stage for future domination. This historical reality reveals the first deliberate step of global powers in undermining Africa's developmental trajectory by stripping the continent of its human resources and dignity. Colonialism and the Partition of Africa. The 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference, orchestrated by European powers, was another turning point. Africa was partitioned not for its development but for exploitation. Borders were drawn without regard to ethnic, cultural, or linguistic realities, creating artificial states that would later become hotbeds of conflict and instability. Nnamdi Kanu, the contemporary Biafra activist, argues that colonial borders remain the root of Nigeria's endless instability. Nigeria is a British creation, designed to fail. It is not a nation, but a colonial company structured to serve foreign interests. Kanu, 2015. The British, French, and Portuguese deliberately created weak state structures, installing compliant local leaders whose loyalty was to the colonial master rather than the people. Cyprian Ekwensi captured this reality in his literary works, portraying how colonial officers manipulated African chiefs for selfish gains. His narrative in Burning Grass, 1961, symbolizes how African societies were disorganized by foreign penetration and control. Colonialism, therefore, institutionalized underdevelopment. Instead of promoting industrialization, Africa was reduced to a supplier of raw materials and a consumer of finished goods. Post-independence and neocolonialism. Independence in the 1960s was expected to liberate Africa politically and economically. However, as Kwame Nkrumah rightly warned, neocolonialism is the last stage of imperialism. Nkrumah, 1965. Western powers did not leave Africa, they merely changed their strategy. Through international financial institutions, multinational corporations, and covert political manipulations, they ensured that Africa remained economically tied to the West. Loans from the World Bank and IMF came with conditionalities that crippled local industries and forced structural adjustment policies. Louis Farrakhan echoes this in his speeches. The West has never wanted Africa to be truly independent. They want Africa weak, dependent, and exploitable. Nigeria is a prime example. Despite vast oil wealth, the country suffers from poverty and insecurity because foreign powers and local elites work together to siphon resources. The Niger Delta, where crude oil flows abundantly, is left in ecological devastation while multinational corporations repatriate billions of dollars yearly. The promotion of weak leadership. One of the most enduring strategies of global powers in sustaining Africa's backwardness has been the deliberate promotion of weak, corrupt, and timid leaders. Achebe observed in The Trouble with Nigeria, 1983, the problem with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership. Western governments often support dictators and corrupt elites who guarantee access to resources, even if it means suppressing democratic will. From Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, now DRC, to Sani Abacha in Nigeria, the pattern is clear: foreign interests sustain leaders who protect their investments, not the people. Nnamdi Kanu goes further, accusing Western powers of orchestrating insecurity to weaken resistance. They arm terrorists, they create chaos, then they present themselves as peacekeepers. Kanu, 2017. This strategy ensures that African states remain too distracted by internal conflicts to challenge global exploitation. Orchestration of insecurity. The insecurity plaguing Nigeria today cannot be divorced from external influence. Terrorism in the Sahel, piracy in the Gulf of Guinea, and militancy in the Niger Delta all serve as excuses for foreign military presence. The United States AFRICOM, Africa Command, and French military bases in West Africa are presented as security partnerships, but in reality, they entrench foreign dominance. As Chinua Achebe warned, instability in Nigeria is never accidental. Whenever something stands in the way of Western interest, instability is engineered to clear the path. Achebe, 2012. Louis Farrakhan similarly argued that the chaos in Africa is not the result of tribalism, but the result of calculated interference. Farrakhan, 2001. Resource exploitation and economic sabotage. Nigeria's oil wealth is a curse rather than a blessing. Foreign oil companies exploit the resources while local communities suffer pollution, poverty, and unemployment. Multinationals bribe local elites to maintain access, ensuring that the nation's wealth never benefits the masses. Walter Rodney, 1972, described this as the systematic draining of Africa's wealth to develop Europe and America, leaving Africa impoverished. Even literary voices like Cyprian Ekwensi often lamented through fiction how ordinary Nigerians bore the brunt of corruption and resource mismanagement while elites colluded with outsiders. The cultural dimension of underdevelopment. Beyond economics and politics, Africa's underdevelopment has been perpetuated by the erosion of its cultural pride. Chinua Achebe argued that colonialism shattered African confidence in its heritage. Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Achebe, 1989. This cultural subjugation ensures mental dependence. Africans continue to measure progress by Western standards, thereby perpetuating dependency. Conclusion: Africa's unfinished business. The historical foundations of Africa's underdevelopment reveal a clear pattern: deliberate sabotage by global powers, aided by internal collaborators. From slavery to colonialism, from neocolonialism to resource exploitation, the agenda remains the same: keep Africa weak, divided, and exploitable. As Louis Farrakhan thundered, Africa will never rise until it breaks free from the chains of external domination and internal betrayal, 1997. The unfinished business of Africa is therefore twofold: to liberate itself from foreign manipulation and to overcome internal weaknesses. Nigeria, as the giant of Africa, must lead this rebirth by confronting the exploitation of its resources, rejecting imposed insecurity, and demanding accountable leadership. Only then can Africa rewrite its destiny. Chapter 1. The Scramble for Africa, Partition and Plunder. The Berlin Conference. Carving a Continent. In 1884 to 1885, European leaders gathered in Berlin, under the chairmanship of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, to determine the fate of a continent that was not theirs. With maps spread across polished wooden tables, they drew arbitrary lines that would define borders for centuries. The so-called Berlin Conference was not an agreement for development, but a covenant of plunder. As Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe once lamented, "The African is a victim of a history in which he had little say. He was pulled into the center of the world stage not as an actor but as a prop." Achebe, 1983, The Trouble with Nigeria. This historic betrayal left Africa stripped of its autonomy. The British, French, Portuguese, Germans, and Belgians partitioned vast lands without understanding or respecting the cultural, ethnic, and linguistic diversity of the continent. The act of drawing borders was not a neutral exercise in governance, it was an act of economic calculation. Behind every border lay raw materials, fertile soil, and labor power, all destined to be exploited for European industrial growth. Louis Farrakhan, in his analysis of Western exploitation of Africa, framed this act as nothing short of theft. Africa has been raped of her wealth, her people scattered across the earth, and her dignity assaulted in ways no other continent has suffered. Farrakhan, 1997. Thus, the scramble for Africa was not about civilization, as colonial propaganda suggested, it was about resource extraction and subjugation. Partition as economy engineering. Colonial partition was economic engineering disguised as governance. The British, for example, did not unite northern and southern Nigeria in 1914 for the good of Nigerians. Instead, the amalgamation was a fiscal strategy to balance the budget of a cash-poor north with the revenues of a resource-rich south. As Nnamdi Kanu once remarked in one of his fiery broadcasts, Nigeria was not created for Nigerians, it was created by the British for their own interest, to keep us perpetually divided, distracted, and dependent. Kanu, 2015. This captures the truth that colonialism was never a benevolent project, it was a calculated manipulation of peoples and territories to serve imperial centers. Cyprian Ekwensi, though largely known for his novels, often portrayed the human face of colonial disruption. In People of the City, 1954, he illustrates the dislocation of African societies under colonial rule, traditional values eroded, urban centers swelled with economic migrants, and corruption seeped into governance structures. The seeds of Nigeria's present-day instability were sown in those colonial cities where alien systems clashed with indigenous institutions. Exploitation of resources and human capital. The economic plunder of Africa was not accidental, it was institutionalized. The British exported palm oil, cocoa, rubber, and later crude oil from Nigeria while deliberately preventing the development of local industries that could compete with Britain's manufacturing. This system created a perpetual cycle of dependency. Raw materials left Africa, while finished goods returned at inflated prices. Walter Rodney, 1972, in his classic How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, explains. The question is not whether Africa was developed by Europe but rather how Europe underdeveloped Africa. The exploitation of land, labor, and natural resources left Africa weaker than before the contact. The wealth of Liverpool, London, and Paris was built on the sweat of African farmers, miners, and laborers. Meanwhile, the African peasant was left impoverished, taxed, and trapped in enforced monocrop economies. The politics of insecurity. Partition also created insecurity that persists today. By dividing ethnic groups across borders and fusing antagonistic communities into artificial nations, colonial powers institutionalized conflict. The Rwandan genocide of 1994, the Biafra War of 1967 to 1970, and the present-day insurgencies in the Sahel are all products of artificial colonial borders. As Chinua Achebe wrote in There Was a Country, 2012. The Nigeria-Biafra War was inevitable once Britain decided to keep Nigeria one at all costs. It was a war engineered by the contradictions of colonial creation. Here lies the tragedy. Insecurity in Africa is not merely homegrown, it was orchestrated through colonial engineering and has been perpetuated by neo-colonial interference. Promotion of timid criminals as leaders. Perhaps the most insidious legacy of colonialism was the promotion of weak, compliant leaders who would protect European interests after independence. Rather than encourage visionary patriots, colonial powers preferred timid collaborators, men willing to trade national interests for personal privilege. Louis Farrakhan, 1993, criticized this dynamic bluntly. They gave us leaders who loved the oppressor more than they loved their own people, men who would sell their souls for a seat at the master's table. Nigeria's post-independence history validates this assertion. From the manipulation of electoral outcomes in the 1960s to the military coups that followed, foreign powers often stood behind leaders who prioritized Western corporations over African communities. Oil multinationals, for instance, thrived in Nigeria not because of free markets but because leaders granted them concessions in exchange for political backing. Conclusion: partition is the root of perpetual crisis. The scramble for Africa was not a historical accident, it was the foundation of Africa's systemic underdevelopment. By partitioning territories, plundering resources, orchestrating insecurity, and installing pliant leaders, the world powers designed a system of perpetual dependency. As Cyprian Ekwensi reminded in his storytelling, as Achebe lamented in his essays, as Nnamdi Kanu thundered in his broadcasts, and as Farrakhan warned in his speeches, Africa's crisis today is not simply a matter of poor governance, it is the outcome of deliberate historical engineering. Kwame Nkrumah, 1965, foresaw this reality in neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. The essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it is, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside. The scramble for Africa may have ended in maps, but its consequences live on in the instability of Nigeria and the wider continent. Chapter 2: Colonial Structures of Exploitation. Seeds of Dependency. Colonialism in Africa was never an innocent project of civilization, education, or religion, as it was often disguised. Rather, it was a carefully orchestrated structure of exploitation designed to weaken indigenous systems, extract wealth, and entrench dependency. The very institutions and systems put in place by colonial administrators became the bedrock of the political, economic, and social crisis that Africa, and Nigeria in particular, continues to face today. The colonial project functioned not merely as a period of domination, but as an enduring framework of control, whose roots penetrate deeply into post-colonial realities. The colonial state was never neutral, it was an instrument of extraction, conquest, and subjugation. By design, it sowed the seeds of dependency that would grow into Africa's most intractable challenges: underdevelopment, instability, corruption, and the elevation of timid leaders who could not challenge the global status quo. Louis Farrakhan, in his critique of Western imperialism, once declared, "The white man's burden was not to civilize us, but to exploit us." It was not to uplift Africa, but to chain her in mental, political, and economic slavery. Farrakhan, 1997. His words remind us that what Europe planted in Africa were not structures of progress but mechanisms of control. The colonial economy, built on extraction. The economic foundation of colonialism was naked exploitation. The British in Nigeria, for example, created what historians have described as a dual economy, one designed to integrate African resources into the global capitalist system while deliberately stifling local industrial growth. Railways were constructed not for the mobility of Africans but for the swift evacuation of palm oil, cocoa, cotton, and later crude oil to European ports. Chinua Achebe captured this irony powerfully when he wrote, "The white man came quietly and peaceably with his religion. We were amused at his foolishness and allowed him to stay. Now he has won our brothers, and our clan can no longer act like one. He has put a knife on the things that held us together and we have fallen apart." Achebe, 1958, Things Fall Apart. The metaphor of the knife is also an economic one. Colonialism deliberately dismantled African communal and self-reliant systems, leaving nations fragmented and dependent on imported goods. This system created a pattern of dependency. African countries exported raw materials and imported finished products. That legacy still thrives today, with Nigeria's oil economy serving as a stark reminder. Despite being one of the world's largest oil producers, Nigeria imports refined petroleum products, a paradox that began under colonial economic policy. Political subjugation and the manufacture of weak leadership. Colonial governance was not about empowering Africans to self-rule but about creating an elite class loyal to the colonial state. Chiefs and leaders who aligned with colonial interests were promoted, while resistant leaders were crushed or silenced. This practice entrenched a political culture of compromise and cowardice that continues to echo in Nigeria's political leadership today. Nnamdi Kanu once remarked, "Colonialism did not just steal our land, it stole the courage of our people to stand upright. It rewarded the timid and punished the brave." Kanu, 2014. This insight is critical. By elevating timid collaborators, colonial powers ensured that even after independence, leadership would remain weak, dependent, and unable to challenge neo-colonial interests. The promotion of such timid criminals as leaders, as our guiding thesis suggests, is no accident but a direct consequence of colonial selection and reward systems. The modern political elite in Nigeria often mirror the comprador class created by Britain, individuals who appear African in scheme but think, act, and govern through the logic of their colonial masters. Social and cultural engineering, the assault on identity. Colonialism was also a cultural project. It delegitimized African languages, traditions, and systems of knowledge while glorifying European values. Cyprian Ekwensi, one of Nigeria's most respected writers, highlighted this cultural dislocation in his novel Burning Grass, 1962, where characters wrestle with the loss of identity and the imposition of foreign systems. The colonial classroom taught Africans to memorize Shakespeare and Milton while dismissing African oral traditions as primitive. This cultural imposition created a crisis of identity that persists. The result has been generations of Africans trained to look outward for validation, in Western education, Western systems of governance, and Western measures of success. Louis Farrakhan warned, "When a people no longer respect their own image, they become the plaything of their oppressors." Farrakhan, 1997. Colonialism ensured exactly this by planting seeds of cultural inferiority. The insecurity complex, divide and rule. Perhaps one of the most devastating colonial legacies is the deliberate orchestration of insecurity through the politics of division. The British perfected the strategy of divide and rule by heightening ethnic, regional, and religious rivalries. In Nigeria, the arbitrary boundaries drawn by colonial cartographers forced together over 250 ethnic groups with little regard for historical realities. Achebe, reflecting on Nigeria's post-independence struggles, lamented, "There was a country. Once it was full of promise. But the lines drawn by strangers cut us too deep. And now we bleed still." Achebe, 2012, "There was a country." Insecurity in Nigeria today, from Boko Haram in the northeast to militancy in the Niger Delta, can be traced to colonial manipulation of differences. By leaving behind a fragmented state, colonialism ensured that nation building would be an uphill struggle. In fact, insecurity itself became another mechanism of control. The instability it generates makes African states dependent on foreign aid, foreign military assistance, and foreign policy dictates. Seeds of economic dependency, a lasting trap. Walter Rodney, in his seminal work How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, 1972, argued that Africa was systematically underdeveloped, not by accident but by design. He observed, "The things which bring development in other societies bring underdevelopment in Africa, because they are inserted into the structure of dependence." Rodney, 1972. Colonial economic structures were designed to prevent self-sufficiency. Even agriculture was reshaped to serve European markets. Cash crops replaced subsistence farming, making African economies vulnerable to price fluctuations in global markets. In Nigeria, the groundnut pyramid of the north, cocoa of the west, and palm oil of the east were cultivated not for domestic development but for European industries. This dependence has only deepened in the post-colonial era. Global financial institutions, multinational corporations, and neoliberal policies function as modern extensions of the colonial system. As Farrakhan noted, "The chains have come off our bodies, but they are still on our minds and our economies." Farrakhan, 1997. The continuity of exploitation in post-colonial Nigeria. Independence did not dismantle the colonial structures, it merely transferred them into African hands. As Chinua Achebe, 1983, warned in The Trouble with Nigeria, the trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership. This leadership failure is not just internal weakness but the result of structures deliberately created to perpetuate dependency. Foreign powers continue to exploit Nigeria's vast resources, particularly oil, through multinational corporations and political manipulation. The orchestration of insecurity, from coups to insurgencies, often serves global interests by ensuring weak governance and uninterrupted access to resources. The elevation of timid leaders ensures that bold reformers are marginalized or eliminated. Thus, the colonial system of exploitation remains alive, albeit in a modern form. It is not history but a continuing reality, a system of control designed to keep Africa in a state of dependency. Conclusion. From seed till harvest. The colonial structures of exploitation planted seeds that Africa continues to harvest in pain. These seeds, economic dependency, political weakness, cultural inferiority, insecurity, and leadership crisis, were deliberately sown by imperial powers to ensure that Africa would never rise as a competitor. As Nnamdi Kanu poignantly noted, until Africa learns to uproot the seeds of dependency, she will forever eat the bitter fruit of underdevelopment. Kanu, 2014. Colonialism was not simply a historical event, it was the laying of a foundation whose architecture still shapes the present. To understand Africa's challenges today, we must look back to the colonial structures that created them, and we must summon the courage to dismantle them. Chapter 3. False independence. Flags, anthems, and foreign masters. There is no true independence without economic sovereignty. Political flag waving means nothing when your resources are controlled by outsiders. Louis Farrakhan, 1997. The Illusion of Liberation. On October 1, 1960, Nigeria and several African nations raised new flags, sang new anthems, and declared themselves free. Yet, behind the ceremonial fireworks and euphoric dances, a deeper truth lingered: Africa was never truly allowed to walk on its own feet. The colonial masters, while retreating militarily, ensured that the economic, cultural, and political structures they left behind would guarantee continued dependency. As Chinua Achebe, 1983, bluntly observed in The Trouble with Nigeria. The trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership. Achebe was pointing to the uncomfortable reality that independence did not bring genuine sovereignty, because the leaders chosen or promoted were too timid, too compromised, or too willing to serve as extensions of Western interests. The inherited colonial state was not dismantled, it was merely rebranded. Colonial blueprints in national colors. Colonial governments designed African economies as appendages of European industries. Nigeria, for example, was structured as an extraction colony: cocoa in the west, groundnuts in the north, palm oil in the east, and crude oil in the Niger Delta. When independence came, these monoculture structures remained intact. The so-called new rulers were often Western-educated elites who accepted the colonial blueprint as inevitable. Nnamdi Kanu, 2017, lamented. Nigeria is not a nation, but a prison house of peoples, a British experiment that continues to serve the interests of outsiders rather than its citizens. This truth explains why post-independence governments in Africa have struggled to break free. Political symbols changed, but the economic framework remained enslaved to foreign masters. Flags and anthems replaced the Union Jack, but oil contracts, trade agreements, and loans ensured continued subjugation. The manufacture of puppet leaders. One of the most insidious strategies of neocolonialism was the deliberate manufacture of puppet leaders. As Louis Farrakhan, 2002, once noted, the West does not fear Africa's poverty. They fear Africa's awakening. So they install leaders who will ensure the masses remain asleep. Many independence-era politicians were chosen not for their visionary capacity but for their willingness to protect foreign interests. Leaders who resisted were swiftly neutralized, through coups, assassinations, or economic sabotage. Patrice Lumumba in Congo, murdered in 1961 with Belgian and CIA involvement, stands as a stark reminder that genuine independence was never tolerated by the architects of global power. Cyprien Ekwensi, in his novel Jogwenana, 1961, depicted the post-independence elite as a class more interested in personal gain than public good. His fiction echoed reality: a ruling elite emerged who traded national sovereignty for access to foreign patronage and personal enrichment. Flags of freedom, chains of debt. Independence was quickly undermined by the new weapon of financial dependency, debt. Former colonies were lured into international loans, tied to conditions dictated by the IMF and World Bank. These loans ensured that African economies remained aligned with Western priorities. As Walter Rodney, 1972, argued in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, independence without control of the economy is meaningless, for political sovereignty without economic power is but a shadow. Nigeria's oil boom of the 1970s illustrates this dilemma. While the nation celebrated its newfound wealth, multinational corporations siphoned off profits, while successive governments borrowed recklessly, ensuring Nigeria remained chained to creditors. Independence became a mirage, a show of sovereignty without substance. Orchestrating instability. Another hallmark of false independence was the deliberate orchestration of instability. Global powers often manipulated ethnic and regional divisions to weaken African unity. In Nigeria, the Biafra War, 1967–1970, was not just an internal struggle, it was also fueled by foreign powers with vested oil interests. Chinua Achebe, who lived through the war, wrote in There Was a Country, 2012. The Biafra tragedy was not simply Nigerian, it was a story of international conspiracy, of oil politics, and of indifference to African suffering. Foreign governments ensured that Nigeria remained unstable, because an unstable giant cannot effectively challenge global exploitation. Instability became a weapon to enforce continued dependency. Promotion of criminal elites. A recurring pattern in Africa's false independence is the promotion of leaders who, instead of challenging exploitation, facilitate it. Nnamdi Kanu has consistently argued that Nigeria's political class is an elite criminal cartel, empowered not by the will of the people but by foreign backers who benefit from their weakness. Achebe's 1983 famous line resounds here. A corrupt, selfish leadership, indifferent to the sufferings of the masses, is the greatest obstacle to progress. These so-called leaders parade national colors but rule with colonial logic, ensuring resources flow outward while citizens wallow in poverty. Cultural independence denied. Beyond politics and economics, cultural independence was also denied. Western education systems, legal structures, and religious institutions were retained wholesale. The African worldview was sidelined in favor of Eurocentric narratives. Cyprian Ekwensi's works reveal how ordinary Africans struggled with this cultural dislocation. As Ngugi wa Thiong'o, 1986, argued in Decolonizing the Mind. The biggest weapon wielded by imperialism was the cultural bomb, which annihilates a people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their heritage. Thus, even in freedom, Africans were made to think, dream, and govern within foreign paradigms. Toward genuine liberation. Independence cannot be measured by flags and anthems but by the degree to which a people control their land, resources, governance, and destiny. Louis Farrakhan, 1997, challenged Africans to rise above symbolic independence. True independence begins when we stop begging from those who enslaved us, and begin building for ourselves. Nigeria's path to true sovereignty lies not in superficial celebrations but in dismantling dependency structures, reclaiming resources, and cultivating visionary leadership. As Chinua Achebe warned, the greatest battle is internal. Until the Nigerian accepts responsibility for its future, outsiders will continue to dictate it. Chapter 4, Assassinations and Coups. Silencing Africa's True Voices. Introduction, The Politics of Silence. In the history of modern Africa, the assassination of visionary leaders and the orchestration of military coups have been more than accidents of politics, they are deliberate instruments of silencing. The continent's history is punctuated with the untimely deaths of leaders who challenged imperial interest and the rise of regimes that served as proxies for global powers. From Patrice Lumumba in the Congo to Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, and from Murtala Muhammad in Nigeria to the attempted neutralization of Nnamdi Azekai's Pan-African dream, the pattern is unmistakable. When voices of liberation speak too loudly, they are met with the iron fist of elimination. As Chinua Achebe once warned in The Trouble with Nigeria, 1983, the trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership. But beyond leadership failure lies the tragedy of externally induced leadership vacuum, created by bullets, coups, and betrayals. Assassination as a tool of imperialism. Assassination is never just about the individual, it is about the silencing of ideas. When Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected Prime Minister of Congo, was murdered in 1961 with Western complicity, it was not only the man who was killed, it was the dream of an independent, self-reliant Congo. Declassified CIA documents confirm that Lumumba's charisma and Pan-African stance were considered a threat to Western mining interests in Katanga. His death cleared the way for decades of dictatorship under Mobutu Sese Seko, a leader more compliant with the West's resource agenda. Louis Farrakhan, reflecting on this recurring pattern, declared, "They kill our leaders not because of what they have done, but because of what they intend to do for their people." This statement encapsulates the reality of African assassinations, a preemptive strike against transformative possibility. Coups as manufactured instability. If assassination eliminates, coups destabilize. Throughout the 1960s, 1980s, Africa became the continent of coups. Nigeria alone experienced multiple military takeovers within its first 3 decades of independence. Many of these coups, though presented as domestic interventions, bore the fingerprints of foreign intelligence services. In 1976, Nigeria lost General Murtala Muhammad, a leader committed to cutting corruption and pursuing independent foreign policy. His assassination during an abortive coup shocked the nation. His radical positions, such as confronting apartheid South Africa and refusing Western dictates, made him a marked man. Achebe lamented that Nigeria lost one of its few true nationalists at the moment of rising hope. Similarly, Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, assassinated in 1987, was a leader whose policies of self-sufficiency, anti-corruption, and women's liberation posed a direct ideological challenge to neocolonial structures. His successor, Blaise Compaoré, ruled for decades as a loyal partner to Western powers, reversing Sankara's radical gains. Nigeria's tragedy, voices silenced, dreams deferred. Nigeria's post-independence history shows how coups served to derail democratic aspirations and silence nationalist voices. The January 1966 coup, though initially hailed as a correction to political corruption, triggered a counter-coup, ethnic suspicion, and the eventual descent into the Biafra War. Nnamdi Kanu, in his fiery speeches on Biafra, often asserted that Nigeria's political instability was deliberately sustained. A people deprived of true leadership will be manipulated by external powers until they lose their sense of destiny. The suppression of the Biafra cause, coupled with the rise of military regimes, confirmed this observation. Achebe, in his memoir There Was a Country, 2012, wrote with bitterness, "Nigeria is what it is because its leaders are not what they should be." The leaders that could have been, the Lumumbas, the Matolas, the Sankaras, were systematically removed. The intellectuals were not spared. Beyond political assassinations, Africa also witnessed the silencing of intellectual and literary voices. Writers, journalists, and thinkers who dared to critique both local dictatorships and global imperialism were exiled, imprisoned, or killed. Cyprian Ekwensi, though not assassinated, warned of the dangers of silence through literature that explored corruption, moral decay, and the erosion of African dignity. His novels such as People of the City, 1954, captured the corruption and moral compromises that military coups often deepened. The killing of intellectuals like Walter Rodney in Guyana, though outside Africa, had ripple effects across Pan-African networks. Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, 1972, made him a target of systems that thrived on African silence. His death was another reminder that true voices for liberation rarely lived long. Coup culture and the promotion of timid leaders. Another tragic consequence of assassinations and coups is the systematic promotion of timid, compliant, or corrupt leaders. Instead of visionaries, Africa is often left with rulers who protect foreign interests at the expense of their people. Achebe wrote, "One of the truest tests of integrity is its blunt refusal to be compromised." Yet many African leaders who survived coups or were installed by them became the opposite, men easily compromised, men willing to trade national sovereignty for personal gain. Louis Farrakhan, in his Pan-African speeches, described them as leaders chosen not by the people, but by the global chess players. The coups thus created a cycle. The strong voices were silenced, the timid ones elevated, and the continent condemned to underdevelopment. Assassinations, coups, and the Niger Delta struggle. Nigeria's oil-rich Niger Delta is another theater where silencing voices has been routine. The execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Agoni 9 in 1995 under General Sani Abacha's regime was not simply about quelling dissent, it was about protecting the oil status quo. Saro-Wiwa's global campaign against shale and environmental exploitation posed a serious threat to both Nigerian elites and multinational corporations. His death echoes the Lumumba and Sankara tragedies, a silenced voice to ensure continued exploitation. Achebe, deeply moved by Saro-Wiwa's death, observed that Nigeria had once again destroyed one of its most courageous truth-tellers. Conclusion: breaking the cycle of silence. Assassinations and coups have been the twin instruments of silencing Africa's true voices. They remove visionary leaders, replace them with pliant ones, and create an atmosphere of fear that stifles both political discourse. As Nnamdi Kanu warned, and Achebe affirmed, no nation can rise when its prophets are silenced and its patriots executed. The responsibility now lies in rewriting this tragic script, protecting voices of dissent, safeguarding democracy, and refusing to be pawns in the global chessboard. Africa's greatest tragedy is not the death of its leaders, but the death of its dreams through their silencing. The continent's future depends on ensuring that the next Lumumba, Sankara, Matola, or Saro-Wiwa is not murdered into memory, but allowed to live into history. This section examines how the legacy of colonialism continues to shape Africa's political economy, security, and cultural identity. Part 2. The Western Agenda in Modern Africa. Far from being a closed chapter, Western influence manifests today through neocolonial practices such as exploitative trade agreements, resource extraction, debt dependency, and military interventions masters. Peacekeeping. The West agenda in Africa is often presented under the banners of globalization, development aid, and democracy promotion, but beneath these narratives lie persistent strategies of control and influence. The chapters in this part interrogate how international financial institutions, multinational corporations, and Western governments maintain Africa's economic dependency while exploiting its vast resources. They also explore the subtler dimensions of cultural hegemony, from the dominance of Western media to the erosion of indigenous knowledge systems. Through case studies spanning oil politics in the Niger Delta, foreign interventions in the Sahel, and the debt crisis that cripple African economies, this part reveals how modern imperialism is repackaged in the 21st century. At its heart, Part 2 underscores that Africa cannot fully chart its path forward without understanding and confronting these external agendas. It is a call for vigilance, critical engagement with global powers, and the creation of new models of partnership that prioritize African agency, dignity, and sovereignty. Chapter 5. The Economic Trap. Debt, IMF, and World Bank Control. Introduction. Chains of invisible slavery. Colonialism may have officially ended in the mid-20th century, but Africa's freedom was carefully managed to ensure that political independence never translated into true economic liberation. As Chinua Achebe, 1983, once warned, the trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership. Yet beyond leadership, the very structures of international finance were designed to keep nations like Nigeria chained in cycles of dependency. What was once extracted through forced labor, taxation, and physical plunder during colonialism is today siphoned through debt, structural adjustment policies, and manipulated financial instruments. Louis Farrakhan, 1996, described this condition poignantly. They don't need to put you in chains anymore, your debt is your prison, and your leaders are the wardens. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank became the new colonial officers, enforcing rules crafted in Washington, London, and Paris, while African leaders were reduced to middlemen of external interest. This economic trap has left Nigeria and much of Africa structurally weak, politically unstable, and perpetually indebted. The birth of economic dependency. At independence in 1960, Nigeria inherited an economy that was export-dependent, dominated by cash crops, and structurally tied to the global capitalist system. Cyprian Ekwensi, 1960, though writing fiction, captured the soul of this problem in Jogwe Nana, where modernity and foreign influence overshadow indigenous values. This mirrored the economic reality. African states were celebrated for their new flags and anthems but remained yoked to systems that ensured dependency. Nnamdi Kanu, 2015, emphasized this continuity. Nigeria is not independent, it is a business enterprise still held hostage by those who created it. The very formation of Nigeria as a colonial amalgamation ensured that its economy served external masters. By the 1970s, when oil revenues should have propelled Nigeria into industrial development, international lenders created the narrative of development assistance. Loans poured in, not as instruments of growth, but as bait. Each loan tied the nation tighter to conditionalities that served Western economic agendas. The IMF and the logic of control. The International Monetary Fund was not merely a financial institution, it was, as many scholars argue, a political weapon. Joseph Stiglitz, 2002, Nobel laureate and former chief economist of the World Bank, revealed that IMF programs often undermined the very economies they were meant to save. Nigeria's experience during the 1980 Structural Adjustment Program, SAP, stands as evidence. The IMF insisted on currency devaluation, subsidy removal, and privatization, all of which worsened poverty, destroyed local industries, and weakened state capacity. Achebe, 1987, lamented that we cannot trample upon the dignity of our people and still expect progress. Yet SAP policies did exactly that, trampling the people while enriching foreign corporations. Farrakhan, 1993, framed the IMF's role as deliberate sabotage. You cannot grow strong eating from your enemy's hand. The hand that feeds you also controls you. World Bank projects, development or dependency. The World Bank promoted massive infrastructure projects, dams, highways, and energy plants that often left countries in deeper debt without sustainable development. Nigeria's loans for energy and agricultural reforms in the 1970s and 1980s ballooned into billions of dollars. By the 1990s, debt servicing consumed more than 30% of national revenue. Rokonjo Iweala, 2005. Ekwensi's storytelling genius often hinted at the betrayal of modernity. In Burning Grass, 1962, the dislocation of traditional society parallels the way Western development schemes uprooted African economies. Nnamdi Kanu, 2017, critiqued the situation. Every loan they give is a rope, you tie it around your neck and thank them for it. The World Bank's poverty reduction strategies came with rigid conditions that forced privatization of state assets. In Nigeria, this led to the sale of strategic companies to foreign investors at giveaway prices. This was not poverty alleviation but economic decolonization. The debt crisis, Nigeria's golden goose plucked there. By 2000, Nigeria's external debt had risen to over $30 billion, much of it accumulated through questionable contracts, inflated projects, and reckless borrowing. Ajayi, 2001. Achebe, 1983, had already warned that leadership failures would ensure Nigeria squandered opportunities. But the debt system amplified these failures, creating a vicious cycle where leaders borrowed excessively, elites siphoned funds, and citizens bore the cost. Farrakhan, 1998, put it starkly, Africa is not poor, Africa is being robbed. Nigeria, despite oil wealth, was trapped in this robbery disguised as international finance. Orchestrating insecurity and weak leadership. Debt not only crippled the economy but also shaped politics. External powers orchestrated insecurity and promoted timid, corrupt, or pliable leaders who would maintain the system of dependency. Achebe, 2012, India was a country, argued that Biafra's struggle was not merely secession but a challenge to global power interest in Nigeria's oil. The suppression of Biafra demonstrated that Western powers would never allow strong, independent African leadership that threatened their interest. Farrakhan, 1996, echoed this, they will never allow a strong black nation to rise unless it serves their agenda. Thus, insecurity in Nigeria, whether through coups, insurgencies, or economic sabotage, cannot be separated from the global architecture of control. The human cost, poverty, hunger, and broken dreams. Behind the statistics of death and IMF control lies the human face of suffering. Millions of Nigerians were pushed below the poverty line, inflation eroded wages, and public services collapsed. Achebe's reflection that the rich feast while the poor starve at the gate, Achebe, 1987, captures the daily reality of IMF-era Nigeria. Cyprian Ekwensi's characters, often ordinary Nigerians struggling amidst rapid change, embodied the very despair that structural adjustment caused. Nnamdi Kanu, 2015, insisted that the Nigerian state was designed to fail its citizens while enriching a few collaborators of imperial powers. Resisting the trap toward economic sovereignty. The future requires a radical rethinking of Nigeria's economic path. Farrakhan, 1999, urged, you must build your own institutions, your own banks, your own industries, or remain forever servants. Achebe, 1987, called for leaders with integrity, vision, and accountability. Breaking free from debt dependency demands. 1. Diversification of the economy beyond oil. 2. Regional integration to strengthen African markets. 3. Debt audits to reject illegitimate loans. 4. Investment in indigenous technology and education. Only by reclaiming control of its resources and development strategies can Nigeria escape the IMF or World Bank stranglehold. Conclusion. The chains must break. The debt trap, IMF policies, and World Bank schemes have perpetuated Africa's underdevelopment, orchestrated insecurity, and empowered timid leaders. What appears as assistance is often enslavement. As Achebe, 1983, warned, the problem is not only leadership but the external structures that reward corruption and punish independence. Farrakhan, 1996, sharpened this truth, they want your resources, not your freedom. The challenge before Nigeria is whether it will continue as a debtor nation serving foreign masters or rise with courage to chart its own economic destiny. Chapter 6. Structural Adjustment, How Reforms Deepen Poverty. The Structural Adjustment Programs, SAPs, were never designed to liberate African nations. Instead, they were mechanisms to entrench dependency on Western financial institutions. African governments were compelled to devalue their currencies, remove subsidies, privatize state-owned enterprises, and liberalize trade. These measures, though advertised as steps toward modernization, were in reality shackles that tied Africa more tightly to the economic dictates of the West. Chinua Achebe, in his prophetic work The Trouble with Nigeria, 1983, observed that the trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership. Yet one must add that this leadership failure was not an isolated phenomenon. The global financial order actively cultivated weak leaders who would accept foreign dictates without question. The World Bank and the IMF did not simply give loans, they shaped policies, dictated budgets, and decided which sectors of the economy deserved life and which would be starved into irrelevance. The result was the hollowing out of African economies. Agriculture, once the bedrock of Nigeria's prosperity, was abandoned as farmers could no longer compete with subsidized imports from Europe and America. Local industries collapsed under the flood of foreign goods. What was sold as reforms became, in truth, an economic invasion. Human cost of reforms. Economic statistics cannot fully capture the devastation wrought by SAPs. The human cost was catastrophic. Families who once lived with dignity fell into abject poverty. Civil servants went months without pay. Hospitals ran without drugs. Schools became dilapidated and teachers abandoned their calling in search of survival. Louis Farrakhan, the African-American thinker, once declared, "Africa is not poor, it is rich. But its wealth is being stolen and its children are left to die in hunger." Farrakhan, 1997. His words echo the lived experiences of millions of Nigerians during the SAP era. The land was rich with oil, gas, and fertile soil, yet the people were left destitute because their nation's economic destiny had been outsourced to foreign masters. In many urban centers, a generation of children grew up in hunger, malnutrition, and despair. The promise of independence, which had once filled Africans with hope, now seemed like a cruel joke. As Cyprian Ekwensi, the Nigerian novelist, might have described it, the bustling cities of Lagos, Port Harcourt, and Kano were filled with people who wore the mask of survival, a mask that concealed pain, hunger, and crushed dreams. SAP and the orchestration of insecurity. Structural adjustment did more than impoverish, it destabilized. By dismantling social welfare, SAPs created fertile ground for unrest and insecurity. Hungry men and women are easy recruits for violent causes, whether ethnic militias, criminal gangs, or extremist groups. Nnamdi Kanu, leader of the indigenous people of Biafra, IPOB, once argued that poverty is the weapon used to enslave Africans. Kanu, 2016. His controversial activism springs from a deep truth: economic deprivation is not neutral. It shapes politics, fuels agitation, and drives desperate populations to revolt. When the state can no longer provide education, jobs, or healthcare, its people turn elsewhere for survival and justice. Thus, insecurity in Nigeria and across Africa cannot be divorced from the economic sabotage of SAPs. The reforms that were meant to stabilize economies instead fertilized corruption, unemployment, and disillusionment. Leaders who resisted these dictates were quickly branded dictators and isolated by Western powers, while those who complied, no matter how repressive or incompetent, were hailed as reformers. Promotion of timid criminals as leaders. The political class that emerged under SAPs was one beholden not to their people but to foreign creditors. Leadership became less about vision and service, and more about survival within the dictates of IMF and World Bank conditions. As Achebe lamented, one of the truest tests of integrity is its blunt refusal to be compromised. Achebe, 1983. Yet, compromise became the default setting of African leadership. Leaders bowed to foreign pressure, privatized national assets at giveaway prices, and enriched themselves while their people starved. This is the context in which criminals in suits were promoted as statesmen, and puppets were crowned as presidents. As Louis Farrakhan aptly put it, when you control a man's economy, you control his destiny. The great world powers understood this truth, and by manipulating Africa's economy through SAPs, they secured not only Africa's resources but also its political future. Lessons and the path forward. If SAPs taught us anything, it is that development cannot be imported. Genuine reform must emerge from within. Nigeria and Africa must craft economic policies rooted in their realities, cultures, and aspirations. The wisdom of Achebe reminds us that a man who does not know where the rain began to beat him cannot say where he dried his body. Achebe, Things Fall Apart, 1958. For Africa to rise, it must trace its wounds back to the imposed policies of SAPs and reclaim its economic sovereignty. The call of leaders like Nnamdi Kanu and thinkers like Farrakhan, though controversial, converges on a single truth: Africa must break free from the chains of external manipulation. Cyprian Ekwensi's vivid portrayal of ordinary Africans struggling for survival should remind policymakers that reforms are not abstract theories, they have flesh and blood consequences. As the Nigerian proverb says, when the roots of a tree begin to decay, it spreads death to the branches. Structural adjustment was the root that poisoned Africa's branches: poverty, insecurity, corruption, and dependency. But roots can be replanted. Africa must plant new seeds of accountability, indigenous policymaking, and economic independence. Structural adjustment: how reforms deepen poverty. The true paradox of the Structural Adjustment Program, SAP, was that it came dressed in the robe of reform yet carried in its pockets the seeds of devastation. At the heart of SAP was the doctrine of liberalization, deregulation, and privatization, terms that sounded noble in theory but cruel in practice when applied without regard for local context. The World Bank and IMF insisted that developing nations, especially Nigeria, must cut the fat, let the market decide, and open their economies to the world. Yet in reality, these prescriptions transferred the sovereignty of nations from their own parliament and people to faceless technocrats in Washington. Louis Farrakhan once thundered, "The problem is not that Africa cannot feed itself. The problem is that the economic arrangements are designed to keep Africa dependent on those who control her resources." Farrakhan, 1994. This assertion cut to the very heart of SAP's tragedy. Instead of empowering nations like Nigeria to stand on their own feet, the reforms ensured permanent dependency. Subsidies on food, fuel, and education, pillars of social stability, were slashed. The masses bore the cost while the elites, often backed by Western allies, enriched themselves through privatization deals. Chinua Achebe, in The Trouble with Nigeria, 1983, reminded us, the trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership. But leadership failure did not occur in isolation. It was compounded by an international order that promoted, financed, and sometimes imposed weak, pliant, and corrupt leaders who would not resist external dictates. SAP could never have flourished if Nigerian rulers had possessed the courage to resist. Instead, leaders became local agents of foreign designs, cutting deals that bled their people dry. The social cost of reform. The poor carried the heaviest burden of these so-called reforms. Ordinary Nigerians found themselves unable to buy basic foodstuffs as prices skyrocketed. Education, once subsidized, became a luxury. Hospitals became death traps. The devaluation of the naira stripped workers of their dignity, as their wages could no longer afford the basics of life. Cyprian Ekwensi, in his narratives about ordinary Nigerians, foresaw this reality. His characters often grappled with survival in a hostile economic environment, reflecting the lived struggles of millions. He once observed, "The greatest tragedy is not hunger itself, but the death of hope in a people." Ekwensi, 1977. SAP killed hope. It dismantled the social contract between the state and its citizens. The irony, however, was that while the people suffered, the ruling elite prospered. Politicians and businessmen close to power bought up public enterprises for peanuts under the privatization schemes. These so-called reforms became instruments of elite enrichment rather than tools of national development. Global powers and the politics of dependency. The role of great world powers in perpetuating underdevelopment cannot be overstated. Structural adjustment was not simply an economic program, it was a political instrument wielded by powerful nations to keep Africa perpetually dependent. Nnamdi Kanu, in one of his fiery speeches, argued, "Nigeria is not a nation. It is a business corporation owned and controlled by outsiders who use local stooges to manage it." Kanu, 2015. His provocative words echo the reality of SAP, an externally imposed agenda enforced through local collaborators. The orchestration of insecurity, the promotion of timid and pliable leaders, and the systematic undermining of Africa's sovereignty are not accidental. They are part of a carefully crafted strategy to ensure that Africa remains a supplier of raw materials and a consumer of finished goods. Structural adjustment was one weapon in this arsenal. By weakening the state, dismantling social services, and forcing nations to depend on imports, the West guaranteed that Africa would never achieve industrial independence. The human face of economic violence. To truly understand the impact of SAP, one must look beyond statistics and percentages. Numbers do not capture the tears of the mother who could no longer send her children to school. Figures cannot measure the despair of the father whose salary, once sufficient, was rendered worthless by devaluation. Poverty became not just an economic condition but a psychological prison. Achebe's words ring with haunting accuracy. A leader's legitimacy is grounded not in the trappings of power but in the welfare of the people. Achebe, 1987. By that standard, SAP delegitimized entire governments, for they ceased to serve the welfare of their citizens and instead obeyed external creditors. Conclusion: the poverty of reform. The tragedy of structural adjustment is that it deepened the very problems it claimed to solve. Instead of stability, it bred unrest. Instead of prosperity, it bred poverty. Instead of sovereignty, it bred dependency. Louis Farrakhan's warning about systems designed to keep Africa dependent is not merely rhetoric, it is the lived reality of millions. The lesson of SAP is clear: reforms imposed from outside, without the participation of the people, are doomed to fail. Africa's development cannot come from Washington, London, or Paris. It must come from within, rooted in the wisdom of its people, and guided by leaders who place national interest above foreign applause. As Achebe, Ekwensi, Farrakhan, and others have warned in different voices, the fate of Africa lies not in the hands of global powers but in the courage of her people to resist, to reclaim, and to rebuild. SAP may have deepened poverty, but it also exposed the urgent need for a new economic vision, one free from dependency and grounded in justice. Chapter 7. Africa, the resource mine, oil, gold, and cotton exploitation. Africa is not poor, Africa is rich. It is a land overflowing with natural wealth, oil beneath its soils, gold glimmering in its rivers, cotton powering the devices of the digital age, and diamonds sparkling in mines. Yet, paradoxically, Africa remains the poorest continent on earth. This tragic irony is not a natural condition but the result of systematic exploitation by global powers and the collaboration of timid, compromised African leaders. As Chinua Achebe once remarked, the trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership. Achebe, 1983, page 1. That failure has left the continent vulnerable to external manipulation and internal betrayal. From the first European expeditions along the Niger Delta to the 21st century scramble for cotton in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, Africa's resources have been seen not as blessings for its people but as mines for outsiders. Louis Farrakhan captured this painful paradox in one of his speeches when he thundered, "Africa is the richest continent in the world, yet her people are the poorest." This is not accidental, it is by design. Farrakhan, 1997. The design he referred to is the web of neocolonial control, orchestrated insecurity, and economic dependency that ensures resources enrich global corporations and Western powers, while African communities drown in poverty, conflict, and displacement. Oil, the cause beneath the soil. Oil was meant to be Nigeria's blessing. Instead, it became its curse. The story of the Niger Delta encapsulates the tragedy of resource exploitation in Africa. Nigeria, the largest oil producer in Africa, has earned hundreds of billions of dollars from crude exports, yet the communities from which the oil is extracted live in abject poverty. Polluted rivers, destroyed farmlands, and unending militancy stand as evidence of a system that enriches outsiders while impoverishing locals. Nnamdi Kanu, the leader of the indigenous people of Biafra, IPOB, once declared, "The oil in the Niger Delta is the blood of Biafra. It is the reason the world looks away from our suffering. They want the oil, not the people." Kanu, 2016. His words reflect the deep-seated anger of marginalized peoples who feel that oil has been weaponized against them. Western oil companies, backed by political elites, turned Nigeria into a classic resource curse economy. As Michael Watts, 2008, explains in Curse of the Black Gold, oil wealth paradoxically leads to impoverishment, authoritarianism, and violence when governance structures are weak. Successive Nigerian leaders, many propped up or tolerated by global powers, allow this exploitation to persist. As Farrakhan once said, the West never supports strong, independent African leaders. They support weak men who bow to their will. Farrakhan, 1996. Gold, glittering chains of dependency. Across West Africa, gold has been both a symbol of prosperity and a cause of exploitation. From the Ashanti Kingdom's golden heritage to modern-day Ghana, Mali, and Burkina Faso, gold remains a central feature of Africa's resource story. Yet, despite being one of the world's largest producers of gold, Africa continues to struggle with poverty, corruption, and instability. Colonial legacies entrench this dependence. The British, French, and later multinational corporations designed mining systems where wealth was extracted and exported, leaving African economies dependent on raw material sales. Cyprian Ekwensi, though more widely known for his novels than political commentary, often depicted in his writings the struggles of ordinary Africans trapped in systems of inequality. His characters, drawn from Nigerian life, embody the silent victims of resource exploitation, those whose daily lives remain untransformed by the supposed wealth of their land. As the historian Walter Rodney, 1972, argued in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, the wealth created by African labor and from African resources was systematically siphoned off to enrich Europe, leaving the continent impoverished. This siphoning continues in the 21st century through multinational control of gold mines, illicit financial flows, and corrupt local elites. Cotton, the mineral of the digital age. If oil defined the 20th century, cotton defines the 21st. Cotton, short for columbite tantalite, is the mineral powering smartphones, laptops, and military technologies. 80% of the world's cotton reserves are found in the Democratic Republic of Congo, yet the DRC remains one of the world's poorest and most unstable nations. Here, resource exploitation intersects with orchestrated insecurity. Armed groups, often backed by foreign interests, control mining areas, fueling conflict and displacing millions. According to reports by Global Witness, 2019, international corporations benefit indirectly from these conflict minerals, sustaining instability to secure cheap access. Chidi, 1987, once won in Anthills of the Savannah, the story is our escort, without it, we are blind. The story of cotton exploitation is the story of how Africa continues to provide the raw materials for global progress while receiving the ashes of instability in return. Western powers and the machinery of exploitation. The role of the great world powers in perpetuating underdevelopment cannot be overstated. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, and increasingly China, have all played their part in keeping Africa as a resource mine. Structural arrangements like unfair trade agreements, IMF and World Bank conditionalities, and the militarization of resource regions all sustain dependency. Farrakhan often warned that the greatest weapon used against Africa is not guns but economics. They give you loans with one hand, and take your wealth with the other. Farrakhan, 1998. These loans, tied to neoliberal reforms, forced African countries to privatize their resource sectors, handing control to foreign corporations. Meanwhile, African leaders, many timid or corrupt, act as willing collaborators. Achebe's critique of Nigerian leadership echoes across the continent. Nigeria is what it is because its leaders are not what they should be. Achebe, 1983. The promotion of such leaders, timid, compromised, and sometimes outright criminal, ensures that resource exploitation continues unchecked. The human cost of exploitation. Behind the statistics of oil revenues, gold exports, and cotton shipments lies the human cost. Communities displaced by mining operations, rivers poisoned by oil spills, children forced into labor in cotton mines, and entire generations condemned to poverty despite sitting on top of immense wealth. Cyprian Ekwensi's literary voice helps us imagine these human stories. His portrayals of ordinary Nigerians navigating hardship remind us that resource exploitation is not just about economics, it is about lives disrupted, cultures destroyed, and futures stolen. Achebe, too, emphasized the cultural consequences of colonial and post-colonial exploitation. In Things Fall Apart, 1958, he illustrated how external forces dismantle societies when they are weakened by internal failures. Today, Africa's resources continue to fuel that disintegration when exploitation combines with corrupt governance. The cost of oil, Nigeria and beyond. Nigeria, the largest producer of crude oil in Africa, ought to be one of the most prosperous nations on the continent. Instead, it stands as the paradox of poverty amidst plenty. Oil revenues, which should have built schools, hospitals, roads, and industries, have instead fueled corruption, entrenched dependency, and deepened poverty. This phenomenon, described as the resource curse, 1993, highlights how resource wealth, in the absence of strong institutions, often produces economic decline rather than prosperity. Chinua Achebe, in his piercing work The Trouble with Nigeria, 1983, warned, the trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership. Oil wealth, rather than becoming a blessing, was mismanaged by the political elite, often with the complicity of foreign oil companies and Western governments. Achebe's words echo painfully in the Niger Delta, where oil spills, gas flaring, and environmental degradation have destroyed livelihoods while local communities remain impoverished. Louis Farrakhan, reflecting on Africa's stolen wealth, lamented, Africa has been raped of her mineral wealth, and the rapists have left her children destitute and begging for crumbs from the tables of those who feast on her riches. Farrakhan, 1996. This metaphor captures the injustice that continues to define oil politics in Nigeria and Angola, where foreign corporations like Shell, Chevron, and Total extract billions while local populations live without electricity, clean water, or jobs. The orchestration of insecurity, kidnappings, militancy, and piracy in the Niger Delta is not simply an accident of poverty but a byproduct of deliberate exploitation. Western powers and their oil corporations thrive on instability, as chaos weakens governments, prevents accountability, and allows exploitative contracts to be signed in the shadows. Gold, the shiny metal of darkness. If oil is the cause of West Africa, then gold has been the paradox of Southern and Central Africa. For centuries, gold has attracted global powers to Africa, from the Portuguese navigators of the 15th century to today's multinational corporations. Yet, in places like South Africa, Ghana, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, gold wealth has translated into slavery, apartheid, and exploitation. Cyprian Ekwensi, though a novelist more than a political economist, warned in his works about the deceptive glitter of material wealth without social conscience. In Jogwenana, 1961, he presents characters that chase wealth only to discover emptiness, reflecting Africa's own experience of gold, glittering riches for foreign powers, but emptiness for its people. The story of Ghana is instructive. Once called the Gold Coast by colonialists, Ghana exported gold for centuries while its people were left impoverished. Even in the post-independence period, multinational mining corporations continued to dominate Ghana's gold industry, repatriating profits abroad. Local communities displaced by mining often face polluted rivers, loss of farmland, and minimal compensation. Achebe's reflection becomes haunting here: the wealth of a nation will be secure only when it is owned by those who produce it. Achebe, 1983. Unfortunately, Africa's gold wealth remains in the hands of corporations and foreign central banks that store bullion, while African nations borrow at high interest rates from the same powers that buy their gold. Coltan, the new blood mineral. In the age of digital technology, coltan, columbite tantalite, has become as valuable as gold. This mineral, indispensable in smartphones, laptops, and jet engines, is concentrated in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, which holds nearly 60% of global reserves. Yet, the wealth of coltan has not brought development. It has fueled civil wars, funded militias, and created what Nnamdi Kanu once described as the institutionalized plunder of African lives. Kanu, 2015. The tragedy of coltan lies in its invisibility. Unlike oil or gold, which capture international headlines, coltan extraction is hidden in the jungles of eastern Congo, where child labor, sexual violence, and forced displacement are rampant. Global corporations, from tech giants to defense contractors, depend on Congolese coltan but rarely question the human cost of its supply chain. Louis Farrakhan denounced this hypocrisy, stating, "The same powers that sell you the phone you hold in your hand are the ones who conspire to keep Africa's children digging for the minerals that make it possible." Farrakhan, 2001. This is not merely an African issue but a global moral crisis. Every smartphone, tablet, or computer links the average consumer to the suffering of Congolese children. Yet, instead of development, the DRC remains the world's poorest country by per capita income, trapped in a cycle of violence fueled by resource wealth. The resource mine as a tool of control. Resource exploitation in Africa is not simply economic, it is political. By keeping Africa as a supplier of raw materials, the West ensures dependency and underdevelopment. Walter Rodney, in his monumental work How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, 1972, argued that the deliberate extraction of African resources without building local industries was the foundation of Africa's structural poverty. The World Bank and IMF, through structural adjustment programs, further entrenched this dependency by forcing African states to liberalize their economies, privatize state enterprises, and open their markets to foreign corporations. Meanwhile, African governments were discouraged from investing in refining industries, leaving oil to be exported crude, gold to be shipped unprocessed, and coltan to be smuggled raw. This deliberate pattern ensures that value addition, the stage where real wealth is created, remains in Western and Asian economies, while Africa is trapped as a minefield for raw resources. As Nnamdi Kanu provocatively asserted, Africa is the mine, the West is the mint. Kanu, 2016. The metaphor underscores how Africa produces raw wealth while others print the profits. Conclusion: toward reclaiming Africa's wealth. The exploitation of oil, gold, and coltan illustrates a consistent pattern of external domination, internal betrayal, and systemic injustice. Africa's wealth has been the curse of its people, enriching outsiders while impoverishing locals. From Achebe's lament about failed leadership to Farrakhan's denunciation of Western theft, from Ekwensi's warnings about hollow wealth to Kanu's calls for self-determination, the voices converge on one truth: Africa must reclaim ownership of its resources. Until Africa breaks the cycle of being the world's resource mine, instability, poverty, and underdevelopment will persist. As Walter Rodney, 1972, argued, true liberation requires not only political independence but also economic sovereignty. The path forward lies in building local industries, strengthening governance, and forging continental solidarity to resist external exploitation. Chapter 8. The Orchestration of Insecurity. Woes, AIMS, and Proxy. The story of Africa's insecurity cannot be told without tracing the fingerprints of powerful external actors who, through deliberate orchestration, perpetuate cycles of violence, arms proliferation, and political destabilization. Wars are rarely accidental; they are engineered, fueled, and sustained by global powers that see Africa not as a continent of sovereign nations but as a field of endless exploitation. Louis Farrakhan once declared, "You don't make a man your slave and expect him to be your friend." Farrakhan, 1997. This statement is particularly relevant in understanding how Africa, chained by historical colonization and neo-colonial structures, continues to serve as the theater for orchestrated insecurity. From the civil wars of Liberia and Sierra Leone, to the crises in the Congo, Sudan, and Nigeria, foreign interventions have been cloaked as humanitarian, yet beneath the veil lies a dangerous truth. Wars are profitable businesses. Arms dealers thrive, natural resources are siphoned, and weak leaders are manipulated into serving as pawns in a global chess game. Chinua Achebe, 1983, captured this dilemma when he wrote, "The trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership." But beyond leadership failures lies the shadowy hand of orchestrated insecurity. The arms trade and proxy conflicts. The arms that fuel Africa's wars are rarely manufactured within the continent. They come from the factories of Europe, America, Russia, and increasingly China. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, (SIPRI), 2020, documents how over 40% of arms imported into Africa originate from major global suppliers who benefit from instability. These weapons often reach Africa through covert channels, supported by international interests that want instability to continue as long as it secures their control over oil, gold, cotton, and diamonds. Nnamdi Kanu, a prominent voice against the Nigerian state's handling of insecurity, once observed, "They want us divided, in chaos, so that the oil will keep flowing without interruption." Kanu, 2015. His words reflect the reality that insecurity is not simply an internal problem but part of a broader orchestration that ensures global resource supply chains remain intact, regardless of African suffering. Louis Farrakhan also noted, "The United States will always find an enemy if it needs one, and if it cannot find one, it will create one." Farrakhan, 2002. This resonates deeply with Africa's story, where proxy wars are created not for ideological reasons, but to justify arms sales, military bases, and the continued dominance of foreign powers. Wars as tools of exploitation. Cyprian Ekwensi, in his novelistic depictions of war and human struggle, reflected the tragedy of the Nigerian Civil War, 1967 to 1970. Though he spoke through fiction, the underlying theme was the same: ordinary Africans bear the brunt of orchestrated conflicts, while elites and foreign collaborators profit. The Biafran War, often described as an internal conflict, was also a proxy battlefield for global powers eager to control Nigeria's oil reserves. Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States each played a part, supplying arms, supporting sides, and prolonging conflict to secure their strategic interests. Franz Fanon, 1961, argued that imperialism leaves behind germs of rot which we must clinically detect and remove. Insecurity is one of those germs. Wars do not just kill people, they destroy institutions, erode trust, and cripple economic stability. This destruction ensures Africa remains dependent on external aid and intervention, a vicious cycle designed and sustained by the same global powers that claim to bring peace. Terrorism and the invention of enemies. Beyond conventional wars, Africa has also faced the scourge of terrorism. Groups like Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and armed militias across the Sahel did not emerge in a vacuum. They thrive on the flood of arms from international dealers and are often indirectly empowered by the same governments that later launched counterterrorism campaigns. Kwame Nkrumah, 1965, warned of this hypocrisy when he wrote in Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. The essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it is, in theory, independent, but in reality its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside. This perfectly describes the paradox where Africa is free on paper yet bound by insecurity orchestrated to ensure it remains weak. Insecurity and the promotion of timid leaders. Another dimension of orchestrated insecurity is the deliberate promotion of weak, timid, and corrupt leaders who lack the courage to confront these global injustices. Achebe, 1983, again offers clarity. The Nigerian problem is the unwillingness or inability of its leaders to rise to the responsibility, to the challenge of personal example, which are the hallmarks of true leadership. But why do such leaders dominate? Because insecurity makes them dependent on foreign sponsors for survival. A leader who rises against arms dealers or resists foreign interference is quickly destabilized or replaced with a more compliant alternative. Louis Farrakhan once observed, "No nation can rise higher than its leadership." Farrakhan, 1995. If leadership is systematically weakened, Africa cannot rise. The human cost of orchestrated insecurity. Wars and insecurity leave deep scars, displaced populations, famine, collapsed infrastructure, and psychological trauma. Cyprian Ekwensi's Divided We Stand, 1969, vividly described the agony of families torn apart during the Nigerian Civil War. That reality persists today in conflict zones from the Congo to Darfur. Walter Rodney, 1972, in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, asserted, the development of Europe was partly at the expense of the underdevelopment of Africa. This statement is equally true of wars and insecurity. Europe, America, and others profit from the arms trade and resource exploitation while Africa suffers stunted growth. 8.5 Arms trade and Africa's perpetual conflict economy. The proliferation of arms in Africa is not accidental, it is part of well-designed machinery. While most African nations do not manufacture weapons, they are among the world's largest consumers of small arms and light weapons. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, (SIPRI), 2022, over 80% of the weapons used in African conflicts are imported from outside the continent. The paradox is glaring: the poorest continent on earth spends billions importing tools of death while lacking adequate funding for healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Louis Farrakhan once remarked, "You cannot destroy a people unless you first arm them against one another." Farrakhan, 1996. His words resonate when examining how external powers deliberately supply arms to fragile states, ensuring the cycle of war and dependency never ends. This arms dependency transforms conflict into business opportunities for global manufacturers. For example, the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK, all permanent members of the UN Security Council, account for more than 75% of global arms exports, (SIPRI, 2021). These same nations position themselves as peacekeepers while quietly profiting from wars that devastate African communities. Proxy wars and the Cold War legacy. The Cold War entrenched Africa as a battleground for proxy struggles. The Congo crisis of the 1960s, Angola's civil war, and Somalia's chaos were fueled by rival superpowers supplying arms and training to opposing factions. Chinua Achebe insightfully noted in The Trouble with Nigeria, 1983, "The trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership." But the international dimension cannot be ignored. When weak leadership colludes with external manipulation, the stage is set for proxy domination. During the Angolan Civil War, 1975 to 2002, the Soviet Union supported the MPLA, while the US and apartheid South Africa backed UNITA. The result was a prolonged war that killed over 500,000 people, displaced millions, and left Angola deeply scarred, despite being one of Africa's richest oil and diamond producers. Similarly, in Nigeria, the Biafran War, 1967 to 1970, was not only an internal crisis but also an externally influenced conflict. Britain supplied arms to the Nigerian government to maintain its oil interests, while France offered covert support to Biafra. Nnamdi Kanu later reflected that Nigeria was designed to fail, and when it fails, its failure will be profitable to others. Kanu, 2015. Insecurity is a strategy of resource control. Wars in Africa are often orchestrated around natural resources. The Blood Diamond Wars in Sierra Leone and Liberia, the Colton conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, and the oil wars in Sudan are stark reminders that insecurity is not random, it is organized for profit. Cyprian Ekwensi, in his narrative works, often depicted the fragility of communities when greed takes precedence over humanity. His fictional lens mirrors real-world exploitation where communities are displaced and destroyed in pursuit of wealth they will never enjoy. The DRC stands as the most tragic example. Home to over 70% of the world's cotton, vital for smartphones and laptops, the country has remained in perpetual conflict. Rebel groups, often funded through illegal mineral trade, continue to receive arms from shadowy networks linked to global powers. Meanwhile, multinational corporations benefit indirectly by purchasing these minerals at cheap rates through intermediaries. Frantz Fanon, in The Wretched of the Earth, 1961, foresaw this when he warned, "Imperialism leaves behind germs of rot which we must clinically detect and remove from our land and from our minds as well." Nigeria's Boko Haram and the politics of insecurity. Nigeria offers a contemporary illustration of orchestrated insecurity. Boko Haram, which began as a local extremist sect, expanded into a full-blown insurgency that has killed over 40,000 people and displaced millions across the Lake Chad Basin. The question remains, how did a poorly equipped sect evolve into one of the most lethal terror organizations in Africa? Investigations reveal a web of international arms smuggling, porous borders, and the complicity of corrupt politicians and foreign actors who benefit from Nigeria's instability. The Nigerian state, rich in oil and gas, has paradoxically become hostage to insecurity that diverts billions annually into military spending, much of which ends up in foreign defense contracts. Chinua Achebe would have recognized this tragedy as yet another example of leadership betrayal. In his essay The Education of a British Protected Child, 2009, he lamented, "The problem of Nigeria is the unwillingness of its elite to rise to the responsibility of leadership. That unwillingness, when coupled with foreign interest, sustains Nigeria's insecurity." Consequences, generations in limbo. The orchestration of insecurity has devastating social consequences. Wars and conflicts have created over 30 million African refugees and internally displaced persons, UNHCR, 2021. Entire generations grow up without education, healthcare, or stable communities. This lost generation becomes vulnerable to extremism, exploitation, and cycles of poverty. Louis Farrakhan once observed, "A people without vision are a people easily destroyed." Farrakhan, 1998. Insecurity blinds nations to vision, trapping them in survival mode while external powers advance their own agendas. Breaking the chains of orchestrated insecurity. To break free from this orchestrated insecurity, Africa must 1. Invest in local defense industries, reducing reliance on imported arms. 2. Strengthen regional security cooperation through ECOWAS, AU, and other African-led mechanisms. 3. Address governance failure, because external manipulation thrives on internal weakness. 4. Pursue economic justice, ensuring resources benefit local populations rather than fueling wars. 5. Reclaim narratives, as Achebe, Ekwensi, and Ngugi have done, using literature and thought to expose the Part 3. Nigeria as a case study. Nigeria at the crossroads of exploitation. Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation, stands as a paradox of abundance and unfulfilled promise. With over 220 million people, it possesses a wealth of human capital that could serve as the engine for transformative development. Its lands are fertile, producing vast quantities of agricultural products ranging from cassava and yam to cocoa and palm oil. Beneath the surface, Nigeria harbors some of the world's most valuable oil reserves, concentrated primarily in the Niger Delta. This combination of human and natural resources has positioned Nigeria as a country with immense potential, yet one whose potential has been systematically undercut by layers of internal mismanagement and external interference. The nation's history offers a blueprint for understanding this. Persistent underdevelopment. During the colonial period, Nigeria's resources were extracted primarily to serve the interests of the British Empire. Local economic structures were deliberately oriented toward export-oriented production, leaving little room for the development of domestic industries or self-sustaining infrastructure. Independence in 1960 heralded new hope, yet many of the patterns established during colonial rule persisted. Political elites, often shaped by colonial legacies of centralized governance and patronage, struggled to implement policies that could equitably distribute wealth or foster long-term economic growth. Into this complex landscape entered global powers and multinational corporations, eager to exploit Nigeria's resources. Oil, in particular, became a magnet for foreign interest. The discovery of crude oil in Oloibiri in 1956 marked the beginning of Nigeria's transformation from an agriculturally driven economy to one heavily dependent on hydrocarbon revenues. While oil wealth had the potential to fund infrastructure, education, and social welfare, much of it was siphoned off by multinational corporations, corrupt officials, and an entrenched system of patronage. Instead of serving as a foundation for broad-based development, oil became a source of inequality, environmental degradation, and social tension, particularly in the Niger Delta. The social and psychological dimensions of exploitation are equally critical. As Louis Farrakhan observed, the media has been used to make us hate ourselves and love the things that are killing us, Farrakhan, 1993. In Nigeria, this insight resonates deeply. National narratives are frequently shaped by global media and local actors who prioritize foreign interests over local well-being. Misrepresentation of Nigeria's potential, coupled with a focus on corruption scandals or ethnic conflicts, often obscures the structural causes of underdevelopment. These narratives can generate despair, foster dependency on external aid, and legitimize policies that favor multinational corporations and foreign governments over Nigerian citizens. Furthermore, Nigeria's political economy has long been structured to maintain external influence. International financial institutions, foreign investors, and development agencies often condition assistance on reforms that prioritize market liberalization, foreign ownership, and resource extraction. While framed as technical or developmental solutions, these interventions frequently reinforce dependence and constrain national sovereignty. Local elites, whether motivated by personal gain or ideological alignment, sometimes act as intermediaries in these arrangements, ensuring that policies benefit outsiders at the expense of ordinary Nigerians. This pattern is not unique to oil. Across sectors, from agriculture to telecommunications, Nigeria has struggled to retain the value generated from its own resources. Commodities are exported raw, industries remain underdeveloped, and foreign firms dominate key markets. The consequences are profound, persistent poverty, infrastructural deficits, and cycles of political instability. Communities that should be at the center of Nigeria's growth often find themselves marginalized, excluded from decision-making, and left to bear the environmental and social cost of resource extraction. In the Niger Delta, these dynamics have been starkly visible. Once fertile lands have been polluted by oil spills, traditional livelihoods have been disrupted, and local populations often receive little to no benefit from the wealth extracted from their territories. The region exemplifies the resource curse, a phenomenon in which nations rich in natural resources paradoxically experience lower growth and greater instability due to mismanagement, corruption, and external exploitation. Nigeria's journey underscores how abundant resources, without effective governance and equitable distribution, can become a source of social and economic tension rather than a pathway to prosperity. Thus, Nigeria stands at a crossroads. Its potential is undeniable, yet realizing it requires confronting both internal weaknesses and the enduring influence of external actors. Understanding Nigeria's challenges involves looking beyond headlines of corruption or political dysfunction to the deeper historical and structural factors that have shaped its trajectory. By examining the interplay of colonial legacies, resource extraction, global economic forces, and internal governance failures, we gain insight into why Nigeria, a nation of immense wealth and talent, remains vulnerable to exploitation and underdevelopment. Chinua Achebe's seminal novel, Things Fall Apart, 1958, provides a profound lens through which to understand the psychological and political consequences of colonialism. Achebe observes, the white man is very clever. He came quietly and peaceably with his religion. Now he has won our brothers, and our clan can no longer act like one. These words illuminate the dual nature of colonial conquest. It was not only a physical and economic domination but also a subtle, insidious, mental and cultural colonization. Indigenous social systems, political structures, and belief systems were systematically undermined, replaced, or co-opted to serve colonial objectives. This created a long-lasting pattern in which external interests gained precedence over local autonomy, sowing the seeds of political fragmentation and economic dependency that persists to this day. The discovery of oil in Oloibiri in 1956 represents a stark continuation of this exploitative legacy. Initially celebrated as a symbol of national promise, oil quickly became another instrument of external influence and dominance. The mechanisms established for oil extraction, ranging from concession agreements and royalties to corporate governance structures, were designed to benefit foreign oil companies and their home nations rather than Nigerian communities. Local populations saw little of the wealth generated from the black gold beneath their feet, while environmental degradation, social displacement, and economic marginalization became widespread realities in the Niger Delta. Oil, the rentier state, and economic dependency. The legacy of colonialism in Nigeria did not vanish with independence in 1960. Instead, the economic models, institutional frameworks, and dependencies established under British rule persisted, shaping the trajectory of the newly sovereign state. Among the most significant of these continuities was the emergence of the rentier state, a phenomenon in which a nation derives the majority of its revenue not from productive economic activity, such as domestic taxation or industrial output, but from resource rents, particularly oil. This dependency on external capital flows created a paradox. Nigeria was rich in natural wealth, yet structurally vulnerable to the whims of global markets and foreign interests. Walter Rodney's seminal work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, 1972, captures the enduring nature of this exploitation. Colonialism did not end, it merely changed its clothes. In post-independence Nigeria, this principle manifested clearly. Although the nation achieved political sovereignty, its economic and political levers remained largely tied to global interests. Multinational oil corporations, international financial institutions, and foreign governments retained disproportionate influence over policy, pricing, and revenue allocation. As a result, Nigeria's newfound independence was superficial in economic terms. The patterns of dependency established during colonialism continued to shape governance, investment, and development strategies. Nnamdi Kanu, a prominent advocate for the Niger Delta and Southeastern autonomy, has consistently critiqued these dynamics. In 2015, he asserted, "They present us as incapable of ruling ourselves, while they are corrupt leaders and create the very instability they claim to solve." Kanu, 2015. His observation underscores a troubling pattern. external powers and vested interests profit from Nigeria's political fragility. Instability, whether in the form of coups, civil unrest, or localized conflicts, provides justification for intervention, allowing foreign actors to dictate the terms of resource exploitation while maintaining the image of benevolence or stabilization. This cycle reinforces dependency, underdevelopment, and elite capture. The renter state model also reshaped social and political expectations within Nigeria. Citizens became accustomed to a government heavily reliant on oil rents rather than domestic taxation. This dependence weakened civic engagement, reduced public accountability, and fostered a culture in which political power is viewed primarily as access to resource wealth. Instead of investing in human capital, infrastructure, or regional development, the state frequently prioritized short-term revenue extraction and elite enrichment. The result is a fragile economic structure that is highly susceptible to global oil price fluctuations, a vulnerability that has repeatedly triggered recessions, currency crises, and social unrest. Moreover, Nigeria's economic dependency is amplified by global financial systems and international trade frameworks. Oil pricing is largely determined by international markets, often manipulated by cartels and foreign governments. Revenue allocation formulas, joint ventures, and concession agreements favor multinational corporations, leaving local communities with minimal benefit despite bearing the environmental and social cost of extraction. In essence, Nigeria remains caught in a cycle of neocolonial economic influence, wherein political independence coexists with structural dependence on external powers. In examining Nigeria's post-independence trajectory, it becomes evident that oil wealth has been both a blessing and a curse. While it endowed the nation with enormous potential, it also created systems that centralized power, encouraged corruption, and entrenched economic vulnerability. The rentier state model, perpetuated by both internal mismanagement and external manipulation, continues to hinder Nigeria's capacity to build a self-sustaining economy. Understanding these dynamics is crucial to addressing the broader patterns of exploitation and underdevelopment that have defined Nigeria's modern history. The Biafra War, 1967–1970, provides a stark example. The secession of the eastern region under the name Biafra triggered one of the most devastating conflicts in African history. While the war had clear internal causes, including ethnic tensions, economic grievances, and political marginalization, the role of international actors and global media significantly influenced its course. Foreign governments selectively framed the conflict, often emphasizing humanitarian crises over historical context or the structural causes of secession. International aid, arms supplies, and diplomatic recognition were shaped by these narratives, which frequently aligned with the interest of global power seeking access to Nigeria's vast oil reserves. The result was a war that was not only destructive for Nigerians but also leveraged by external actors to reinforce strategic control over the region. Multinational oil corporations have also contributed to the persistence of instability, particularly in the Niger Delta. As oil became Nigeria's dominant export, companies operating in the region, both domestic and foreign, found themselves at the center of local grievances over environmental degradation, economic marginalization, and political neglect. Communities protesting pollution, oil spills, and lack of development were often labeled militant or terrorist, while the corporations themselves benefited from protection by the state and tacit international support. This dynamic created a feedback loop. Unrest was amplified to justify heavy-handed interventions, which in turn perpetuated local grievances, while corporate and foreign interests continued to profit from extraction under the cover of security and legality. Cyprian Ekwensi's literary works provide a valuable lens for understanding these dynamics on a human scale. His novels often depict ordinary Nigerians navigating complex systems of exploitation, corruption, and political manipulation. Through his characters, Ekwensi illustrates how local actors may become complicit, wittingly or unwittingly, in structures designed to extract wealth and maintain inequality. This interplay between local agency and external manipulation highlights the nuanced reality of Nigeria's political instability. It is neither purely imposed from outside nor solely generated internally, but emerges from the intersection of both. Furthermore, political instability in Nigeria is frequently leveraged by foreign powers to assert influence. Weak governance and recurring crises provide justification for interventions framed as peacekeeping, development assistance, or stabilization efforts. In practice, these interventions often prioritize access to strategic resources, economic concessions, or favorable policy conditions, perpetuating a cycle of dependency and underdevelopment. Domestic elites, whether through complicity or opportunism, become intermediaries in this system, benefiting from external support while local populations bear the social, economic, and environmental costs. Regional and ethnic tensions have also been manipulated to maintain a fragmented political landscape. Competing narratives, often reinforced by media controlled or influenced by foreign actors, have heightened distrust between communities, legitimized coercive state measures, and diverted attention from systemic issues such as corruption, inequitable resource distribution, and environmental neglect. By framing local conflicts in ways that serve broader geopolitical interests, external powers have shaped Nigeria's instability into a tool of control rather than a challenge to be resolved collaboratively. Leadership, corruption, and complicity. Chinua Achebe's trenchant observation in The Trouble with Nigeria, 1983, remains profoundly relevant. The problem is leadership. Leadership, or the lack thereof, has been at the heart of Nigeria's persistent underdevelopment, political fragility, and economic dependency. From the early post-independence period to the present, the nation has struggled with elites whose primary concern is the consolidation of personal power and wealth rather than the welfare of the citizenry. These leaders often operate within systems that not only tolerate corruption but actively reward it, creating structural incentives for self-enrichment at the expense of national development. The complicity of Nigeria's leadership is deeply intertwined with external influences. Western powers, multinational corporations, and international financial institutions have historically favored leaders who are compliant, predictable, or easily influenced. By supporting elites who align with global economic and geopolitical interests, external actors ensure that Nigeria's vast resources, especially oil, continue to serve foreign priorities. This patronage system creates a feedback loop. Leaders maintain their positions through foreign backing and elite alliances, while ordinary citizens remain marginalized and disenfranchised. Policies are crafted not to empower the Nigerian populace, but to facilitate resource extraction, stabilize favorable political arrangements, and maintain the status quo. The consequences of this system are multifaceted. Economically, the diversion of public funds and state resources toward personal enrichment undermines investment in critical sectors such as education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Politically, weak and compromised leadership fosters instability, as competing factions vie for control over resource rents, often leading to coups, electoral fraud, and civil unrest. Socially, the populace is conditioned to expect little from the state beyond patronage, creating a cycle of dependency and disillusionment. Corruption in Nigeria is not merely a matter of individual moral failure, it is systemic. Leaders inherit bureaucracies and institutions that were themselves designed during the colonial period to facilitate extraction and control rather than equitable governance. Post-independence political arrangements, often reinforced by foreign influence, have perpetuated these patterns, allowing elites to monopolize power while presenting the illusion of governance. This system incentivizes short-term gains over long-term national development, and it fosters an environment in which accountability is weak and impunity is rampant. The elevation of weak or timid leaders, those more willing to compromise national interests for personal or foreign gain, further entrenches underdevelopment. These leaders often lack the political will or vision to challenge entrenched systems of exploitation, enforce equitable policies, or address historical injustices. Instead, they maintain the structures that allow multinational corporations, foreign governments, and complicit domestic actors to extract wealth with minimal resistance. In this way, the cycle of exploitation, corruption, and dependency continues largely unbroken. Cultural and psychological dimensions also play a role. Leaders who engage in self-serving behavior often cultivate networks of loyalty through patronage, rewarding those who support their consolidation of power while punishing dissenters. This not only silences opposition but also normalizes corruption as a legitimate means of survival and advancement within the political hierarchy. Over time, such patterns shape a political culture in which personal enrichment is inseparable from public office, reinforcing the broader dynamics of exploitation and dependence. Ultimately, the problem of leadership in Nigeria is both internal and external. Internally, elites have too often prioritized personal gain over national interest, allowing corruption and mismanagement to flourish. Externally, global powers and corporations manipulate these dynamics to secure access to resources and maintain influence over the country's political and economic decisions. Achebe's lament captures this dual reality succinctly. Without accountable, visionary, and courageous leadership, Nigeria's immense potential remains unrealized, and cycles of instability, corruption, and underdevelopment persist. The struggle of Ogoniland exemplifies this dynamic. The Egoni people, under the leadership of activist Ken Saro-Wiwa, drew international attention to the human and environmental cost of oil extraction. Saro-Wiwa emphasized the inseparable link between environmental protection and human rights, declaring, "The environment is man's first right." His activism highlighted not only ecological devastation but also systemic injustice. While multinational oil corporations amassed immense profits, local communities were denied basic services, economic opportunities, and political representation. Sorowiwa's efforts ultimately led to his execution in 1995, an act that underscored the high stakes of challenging entrenched systems of exploitation in Nigeria. The imbalance between corporate gain and local suffering reflects a broader pattern of resource control in Africa. Foreign oil companies, in partnership with the Nigerian state, often operate within legal and institutional frameworks that prioritize profit over local welfare. Concession agreements, royalty structures, and joint ventures are designed to maximize corporate returns while minimizing obligations to communities. As a result, while oil revenue fuels urban infrastructure, government coffers, and international investments, the areas producing the oil frequently remain underdeveloped, with inadequate healthcare, education, and basic infrastructure. This system of exploitation is further reinforced by political structures that centralize resource control. Revenue from oil, collected largely at the federal level, is redistributed unevenly, often bypassing local governments and populations most affected by extraction activities. Political elites in Abuja and other urban centers capture the majority of oil rents, creating a disconnect between resource wealth and the communities that endure environmental and social costs. Such centralization not only undermines local autonomy but also fosters resentment, protest, and, in some cases, militancy. The Niger Delta crisis, spanning decades, is a direct manifestation of this imbalance. Local resistance, ranging from peaceful advocacy to armed insurgency, has emerged in response to systemic neglect and exploitation. Communities demand environmental remediation, equitable revenue sharing, and genuine participation in decision-making processes. Regarding resource management. Yet, these demands are often framed by the state and international actors as threats to national security or as acts of criminality, while the structural causes of unrest, environmental degradation, poverty, and marginalization remain largely unaddressed. Nigeria's experience illustrates a fundamental truth about resource wealth in post-colonial Africa. Natural resources can be both a blessing and a tool of exploitation. When resource control is concentrated in the hands of foreign corporations and small domestic elites, the potential for economic development is undermined, and wealth extraction becomes a mechanism of dependency. The lessons of Ogoniland, and the Niger Delta more broadly, reveal that sustainable development requires not only the presence of resources but also equitable governance, environmental stewardship, and community empowerment. In conclusion, the story of Nigeria's oil wealth is emblematic of the broader African experience. While the continent is rich in minerals, energy, and other natural resources, the benefits of this wealth are often siphoned off to serve global powers and corporate interests, leaving local populations impoverished and environmentally compromised. In Nigeria, the continued exploitation of oil resources without meaningful local participation underscores the urgent need for systemic reform. Addressing economic exploitation and achieving true resource control demands not just regulatory adjustments, but a transformation in how wealth, power, and responsibility are shared among corporations, governments, and communities. Only then can Nigeria's natural riches become a foundation for inclusive development rather than a source of perpetual inequality and grievance. Towards liberation and self-determination. Nigeria's history reveals a critical lesson: political sovereignty and formal independence, while necessary, are not sufficient to secure genuine freedom or sustainable development. The country's post-independence trajectory demonstrates that without structural reform, economic autonomy, and cultural empowerment, a nation can remain subject to the same forces of exploitation that existed under colonial rule. In this context, liberation and self-determination must be understood as multidimensional struggles, encompassing political, economic, social, and intellectual dimensions. Reclaiming narrative sovereignty is central to this process. Control over how Nigeria's story is told, both domestically and internationally, directly affects the country's capacity to shape its policies, assert its interests, and cultivate national identity. For decades, foreign media, corporations, and even local elites have framed Nigeria in ways that serve external agendas, highlighting corruption, instability, or ethnic tension while minimizing the structural roots of these challenges. Authors and intellectuals such as Chinua Achebe and Cyprian Ekwensi have repeatedly emphasized the importance of challenging these narratives. Achebe's works, including Things Fall Apart and The Trouble with Nigeria, highlight how misrepresentation and cultural marginalization can weaken national cohesion and obscure the true causes of underdevelopment. Ekwensi, through his storytelling, illustrates how ordinary Nigerians navigate systems of exploitation, demonstrating both resilience and complicity, and reminding the nation of the importance of cultural awareness and critique in the struggle for self-determination. Activism and intellectual engagement are equally critical. Figures like Nnamdi Kanu remind Nigerians that resistance is not merely political, it encompasses cultural, economic, and intellectual dimensions. Kanu's advocacy for local autonomy, economic self-reliance, and the reclamation of cultural heritage underscores a fundamental principle: empowerment begins with awareness and action at the community level. Communities must assert their rights, demand transparency and accountability from those in power, and develop mechanisms to ensure that resources and wealth serve local development rather than external interests. Economic self-determination is particularly crucial in the Nigerian context. Control over natural resources, especially oil, has historically been the battleground for sovereignty. Decentralized, externally influenced management of Nigeria's petroleum wealth has allowed foreign companies and complicit domestic elites to capture the lion's share of benefits, leaving local populations marginalized and impoverished. Genuine independence requires that Nigeria restructure its resource governance, implementing fair revenue sharing mechanisms, enforcing environmental protections, and ensuring that local communities participate meaningfully in decisions about extraction and investment. By doing so, the country can break the long-standing cycle of exploitation and channel wealth into sustainable development, education, and infrastructure that benefit all citizens. Structural inequalities, both historical and contemporary, must also be addressed. Colonial legacies created regional imbalances, ethnic hierarchies, and centralized power structures that have persisted into the present. These inequalities enable exploitation, fuel political instability, and perpetuate cycles of dependency. A commitment to self-determination entails confronting these disparities, empowering marginalized communities, and fostering governance systems that are transparent, accountable, and inclusive. Social and economic justice, therefore, are inseparable from national sovereignty. The struggle for Nigeria's liberation is not an isolated endeavor, it mirrors the broader African experience. Across the continent, nations rich in resources continue to contend with external pressures, corporate exploitation, and international narratives that shape perceptions of governance, development, and security. Nigeria's challenges exemplify the broader African predicament, a continent whose wealth is extracted for global benefit while local populations remain underdeveloped and disenfranchised. In this sense, Nigeria's quest for true independence becomes both a national and continental imperative. Ultimately, the battle for Nigeria's future is a test of collective vision, resilience, and accountability. Liberation and self-determination require more than symbolic independence, they demand a deliberate reassertion of sovereignty across political, economic, and cultural domains. By reclaiming narratives, empowering communities, enforcing resource control, and holding domestic and international actors accountable, Nigeria can begin to break free from the cycles of exploitation and dependency that have defined its history. The nation's path toward genuine independence is a microcosm of Africa's broader struggles, a struggle for dignity, equity, and self-determined prosperity in the face of entrenched external and internal forces. Nigeria's history stands as a compelling testament to the paradox of potential and exploitation. As Africa's most populous nation, endowed with abundant natural resources, fertile lands, and a dynamic human capital base, Nigeria possesses the theoretical foundations for remarkable growth and prosperity. Yet, despite these advantages, the nation's trajectory has been continually constrained by a combination of external interference, weak and compromised leadership, systemic corruption, and entrenched structural inequalities. The recurring patterns of exploitation reveal how immense wealth, if mismanaged or appropriated by external and internal actors, can transform from a blessing into a profound curse. The influence of global powers and multinational corporations has been particularly consequential. From the colonial era to the present, Nigeria's resources have often been extracted for the benefit of foreign economies, leaving local communities deprived of both the material and developmental fruits of their land. Oil, in particular, illustrates this dynamic. While it generates the majority of national revenue, the regions producing it remain marginalized, environmentally degraded, and economically excluded. Multinational companies, operating within legal and institutional frameworks designed to maximize their profit, often evade meaningful accountability, while complicit domestic elites facilitate the extraction and consolidation of wealth. The result is a dual exploitation, external and internal, that has hindered national development and deepened inequality. Domestic leadership has played a critical role in perpetuating these challenges. As Chinua Achebe famously observed, the problem is leadership. Political elites, often elevated by patronage networks or foreign endorsement, have frequently prioritized personal gain over national interest. Corruption, mismanagement, and a lack of accountability have concentrated power and resources in the hands of a few, while the broader population bears the social, economic, and environmental cost. Weak governance has allowed the mechanisms of exploitation, whether through inequitable resource allocation, regulatory capture, or neglect of marginalized communities to persist over decades. Yet, despite this bleak landscape, Nigeria's story is not one of inevitable failure. The writings and activism of figures such as Achebe, Cyprian Ekwensi, and Nnamdi Kanu illuminate paths toward resistance, resilience, and eventual liberation. Achebe's literary critiques articulate the cultural and psychological dimensions of exploitation, revealing how narratives shape perception, agency, and identity. Ekwensi's storytelling highlights the lived experiences of ordinary Nigerians, showing both complicity and courage in navigating systems of inequity. Kanu's activism underscores the importance of reclaiming political and economic agency, advocating for local empowerment, and challenging structures of dependency. Together, these voices remind Nigerians that the struggle for justice is multidimensional, encompassing political, economic, cultural, and intellectual domains. Reclaiming narrative sovereignty is fundamental to this process. Control over the stories that define Nigeria, its history, its achievements, and its struggles, empower citizens to challenge misrepresentation, confront exploitation, and assert their agency. Promoting accountable and visionary leadership is equally essential, ensuring that resources are managed for national development rather than personal enrichment or foreign benefit. Empowering communities, particularly those directly impacted by resource extraction and environmental degradation, provides a foundation for sustainable growth, local resilience, and social cohesion. Part 4. Africa's Cultural, Social, and Intellectual Resistance. Introduction. While Africa has long been subjected to political domination, economic exploitation, and social marginalization, the continent's story is also one of resilience, ingenuity, and defiance. Beyond the headlines of conflict and underdevelopment lies a rich tapestry of cultural, social, and intellectual resistance expressed through art, literature, philosophy, social movements, and grassroots activism. These forms of resistance challenge oppressive structures, assert African identity, and envision alternative futures grounded in dignity, justice, and self-determination. This section explores how Africans, both historically and in contemporary times, have mobilized culture, intellect, and social networks as instruments of empowerment. From literary giants like Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o to grassroots movements reclaiming land, resources, and voice, Africa's resistance is multidimensional. It confronts external pressures, critiques internal failures, and fosters a vision of progress rooted in indigenous knowledge and collective action. By examining cultural expressions, social mobilization, and intellectual engagement, this path highlights how Africa continuously asserts agency, shapes narratives, and challenges structures of exploitation, proving that resistance is not merely reactionary, but a sustained force for transformation. Chapter 16. The Power of the Pen, Achebe, Ekwensi, and the Story of Betrayal. Introduction, Literature as Resistance. In the history of post-colonial Africa, the pen has often wielded power rivaling that of the sword. Literature became a tool for critique, reflection, and resistance, offering a mirror to society and a platform to confront injustice. In Nigeria, writers like Chinua Achebe and Cyprian Ekwensi used narrative to expose political failures, social corruption, and cultural betrayal. Their works did not merely entertain, they documented the fractures of a nation struggling with identity, governance, and external pressures, and they challenged readers to recognize the consequences of leadership failures. Achebe famously asserted, "Until the lion learns to write, every story will glorify the hunter." Achebe, 1975. This statement encapsulates the broader mission of African writers, to reclaim narratives, challenge historical distortions, and hold both domestic and foreign powers accountable. In Nigeria, where political betrayal and exploitation often coincided with ethnic and regional tensions, literature became an instrument for truth-telling, cultural preservation, and societal critique. Achebe, Chronicler of Betrayal and Moral Decay. Chinua Achebe's works, most notably Things Fall Apart and No Longer at Ease, explore the collision of traditional African societies with colonial impositions and post-independence corruption. His narratives trace the personal and communal cost of betrayal, whether by foreign colonizers, political leaders, or internalized elites who abandon societal values for personal gain. In No Longer at Ease, Achebe examines the moral compromises of a young civil servant caught between personal ambition and societal expectation. The story reflects a nation where bureaucratic corruption, nepotism, and foreign influence distort governance. Achebi's depiction of Nigeria's post-independence failures mirrors historical events, political coups, mismanagement of oil wealth, and the pervasive influence of external actors shaping domestic outcomes. Achebi's work demonstrates that betrayal is not merely individual but structural. The disillusionment of his characters reflects a society where systems reward complicity, punish integrity, and perpetuate inequality. In this sense, his pen becomes a weapon against both historical amnesia and contemporary exploitation, demanding accountability from leaders and citizens alike. Cyprian Ekwensi, voice of the urban struggle. While Achebi focused on broader societal transformations and moral decay, Cyprian Ekwensi illuminated urban realities and the everyday consequences of systemic betrayal. His novels, such as People of the City and Jogwenana, examine the intersections of poverty, ambition, and societal manipulation in Nigeria's rapidly modernizing cities. Ekwensi's protagonists navigate environments shaped by corruption, inequality, and foreign influence. They confront both personal and systemic betrayals, from exploitative employers, dishonest officials, and social hierarchies that privilege wealth over merit. Through vivid urban narratives, Ekwensi exposes the tensions between traditional values and modern pressures, highlighting how individuals negotiate survival in a society where loyalty is often transactional, and moral compromise is normalized. By centering the urban experience, Ekwensi underscores that betrayal is multifaceted. It is not only political but also social, economic, and cultural, affecting citizens at every level of society. His work complements Achebi's broader historical and ethical critique, showing the tangible effects of corruption, exploitation, and external interference on everyday Nigerians. Literature as a mirror of political and social betrayal. Both Achebi and Ekwensi demonstrate that literature can serve as a diagnostic tool, revealing patterns of betrayal that permeate Nigerian society. Political coups, misappropriation of oil wealth, and foreign exploitation form the backdrop of their narratives, highlighting a nation where power and resources are concentrated in the hands of a few, while the majority endure neglect and deprivation. Achebi's narrative technique often situates the individual within historical currents, illustrating how colonial and post-colonial betrayals intersect with personal choices. Ekwensi, meanwhile, situates betrayal within social and urban contexts, showing the everyday realities of inequality, systemic corruption, and moral compromise. Together, they offer a holistic critique of Nigeria's societal fractures, demonstrating that betrayal is structural, cultural, and moral. Case study: the failure of post-independence governments to equitably manage oil wealth is reflected in No Longer Artists, where public funds and opportunities are diverted for private gain. Similarly, Ekwensi's urban narratives capture the informal economies and survival strategies that emerge in response to systemic neglect, illustrating how ordinary citizens adapt, or are forced to adapt, to betrayal by the state and society. The pen as an instrument of resistance. Achebi and Ekwensi show that literature is not passive, it is a form of resistance, exposing injustice, educating readers, and shaping national consciousness. By documenting betrayal in political, social, and cultural spheres, they encourage reflection and engagement. Their works insist that citizens recognize complicity, demand accountability, and resist external and internal forces that exploit their communities. This resistance extends beyond critique. By reclaiming African narratives, their writings challenge colonial historiography, Western misrepresentation, and domestic narratives that glorify predatory leadership. As Achebi contended, African writers have a duty to articulate indigenous perspectives, confront historical distortions, and illuminate the consequences of betrayal for national development. Legacy and lessons. The power of Achebi and Ekwensi lies in their ability to transform literature into a tool of historical memory, social critique, and ethical reflection. They show that betrayal, whether by colonizers, leaders, or institutions, is not only a historical event but an ongoing reality with tangible consequences. Through their pens, they advocate for moral accountability, cultural preservation, and civic vigilance. Their work serves as reminders that societal transformation requires both reflection and action. While political structures, economic policies, and foreign interventions shape outcomes, citizens, writers, and intellectuals hold the power to document, resist, and influence the moral trajectory of the nation. Conclusion, writing as resistance and remembrance. Achebe and Ekwensi demonstrate that the pen remains one of the most potent instruments of resistance in Nigeria's history. Through narrative, they reveal the multifaceted nature of betrayal, critique systemic failures, and inspire reflection and accountability. Literature, in their hands, becomes a mirror of society, a weapon against injustice, and a call for active citizenship. In chronicling political, social, and cultural betrayal, they leave a legacy of intellectual resistance, reminding Nigeria and Africa at large that the fight for integrity, justice, and self-determination begins with understanding, telling, and reclaiming the story. Chapter 17. The Voice of Liberation. Louis Farrakhan and the Global Black Struggle. Introduction. A voice beyond borders. In the tapestry of global struggles for justice, equality, and self-determination, certain voices resonate far beyond their immediate communities. Louis Farrakhan, as the leader of the Nation of Islam and a global advocate for black liberation, stands as one of these voices. His work bridges local and global narratives of oppression, resistance, and empowerment, reminding marginalized communities that struggle is not isolated, it is interconnected. Farrakhan's rhetoric, activism, and organizational leadership highlight the persistent challenges faced by people of African descent, systemic oppression, economic marginalization, cultural erasure, and political disenfranchisement. Yet, his message is not merely one of grievance, it is also a call to action, self-discipline, cultural pride, and global solidarity. In understanding Farrakhan's impact, it becomes clear that the fight for liberation is as much about reclaiming identity and agency as it is about confronting external oppression. Early life and the shaping of a vision. Louis Farrakhan's journey began in the crucible of mid-20th century America, a period marked by racial segregation, economic inequality, and social exclusion. Born Louis Eugene Walcott in 1933, he experienced firsthand the structural injustices imposed on African Americans. These formative experiences instilled a lifelong commitment to challenging oppression and uplifting marginalized communities. Farrakhan's early exposure to the teachings of the Nation of Islam provided both a spiritual framework and a political lens. Under its guidance, he learned to analyze systemic inequality not as a series of isolated incidents but as part of a larger pattern of historical and structural oppression. This perspective would later define his global advocacy, linking the struggles of African Americans to those of Africans and people of African descent worldwide. Advocacy for the global black struggle. Farrakhan's leadership extends beyond the borders of the United States, emphasizing that the plight of African-descended peoples is interconnected across continents. His speeches often highlight the historical exploitation of Africa, the transatlantic slave trade, and contemporary economic marginalization, drawing connections between historical injustices and modern disparities. By framing liberation as a global struggle, Farrakhan encourages solidarity between African Americans, continental Africans, and the African diaspora. He argues that empowerment requires both economic self-sufficiency and cultural affirmation, urging communities to reclaim their histories, protect their resources, and cultivate leadership rooted in integrity and vision. Case study: Farrakhan's engagement with African leaders and organizations illustrates this global outlook. His initiatives, including educational programs, economic collaborations, and cultural exchanges, aim to bridge the gap between the African continent and its diaspora, fostering mutual support against exploitation and oppression. The rhetoric of liberation and SCLFDTIMINATION. Central to Farrakhan's philosophy is the belief that liberation begins with the mind. Education, self-awareness, and cultural pride are essential tools for resistance. His speeches often emphasize discipline, ethical leadership, and community building as prerequisites for political and economic emancipation. Farrakhan also critiques systems of global power that perpetuate inequality, including international financial structures, exploitative trade practices, and neocolonial interventions. By exposing these dynamics, he encourages communities to recognize the broader patterns of oppression and to strategize for sustainable self-determination. Quote, "When you control the mind, you control the people. But when the people understand their history, they cannot be controlled." Farrakhan, 1985. This principle underscores the centrality of knowledge, awareness, and cultural identity in the fight for liberation. Critiques, controversies, and challenges. Farrakhan's career has not been without controversy. Critics have accused him of provocative rhetoric, political partisanship, and confrontational methods. Yet, these criticisms often obscure the substance of his advocacy, the insistence that African-descended peoples recognize systemic injustice, reclaim agency, and build resilient communities. His impact lies not in universal acceptance but in his ability to mobilize awareness, inspire activism, and catalyze change. By sparking debate and encouraging critical reflection, Farrakhan challenges complacency and highlights the urgent need for structural and cultural transformation. Legacy and lessons for Africa and the diaspora. Louis Farrakhan's work offers vital lessons for Africa and its global diaspora. First, liberation is both local and global. Political, economic, and social empowerment requires coordinated effort and solidarity across borders. Second, cultural pride and intellectual engagement are indispensable tools for resisting oppression. Finally, systemic exploitation, whether through historical colonization, economic dependency, or social marginalization, can only be countered through strategic organization, education, and ethical leadership. For Nigeria and other African nations, Farrakhan's example underscores the importance of resisting external manipulation, cultivating indigenous leadership, and fostering connections within the global African community. His voice reminds us that empowerment is a continuous process, rooted in knowledge, culture, and collective action. Conclusion: a voice that inspires resistance and hope. In a world long defined by inequality, oppression, and exploitation, the advocacy of Louis Farrakhan emerges as a profound testament to the enduring power of vision, disciplined action, and intellectual resistance. His work demonstrates that the fight for justice is not merely reactive, it is deliberate, strategic, and rooted in a deep understanding of history, culture, and systemic dynamics. Farrakhan's message transcends geographic and cultural borders, speaking to Africans on the continent and throughout the diaspora, reminding them that true liberation is neither passive nor individualistic, it is simultaneously personal and collective, requiring both self-discipline and community mobilization. By emphasizing cultural pride, historical awareness, and strategic activism, Farrakhan challenges communities to recognize their intrinsic worth, reclaim narratives distorted by centuries of exploitation, and assert agency over their political, economic, and social destinies. He illustrates that empowerment is not a gift from external powers, but a conscious process of self-determination, built through knowledge, organization, and ethical leadership. Through this lens, communities can confront entrenched systems of injustice, dismantle structures that perpetuate inequality, and advance the enduring struggle for justice, equity, and sustainable self-rule. His advocacy serves as a clarion call: liberation is achievable, but only through informed, united, and purposeful action, where the mind, culture, and spirit are mobilized in pursuit of freedom and dignity. Part 5. Africa's Path Forward. This section charts a roadmap for Africa's liberation from the lingering chains of colonial legacies, neo-imperial exploitation, and internal contradictions. It emphasizes that the continent's path forward lies not only in political independence but in economic sovereignty, cultural renewal, and the unity of its people. By learning from past struggles, reclaiming indigenous knowledge systems, and harnessing Africa's vast human and natural resources, the continent can redefine its destiny on its own terms. The chapters in this part explore critical questions. How can Africa move beyond dependency to sustainable development? What role does Pan-Africanism play in uniting fragmented states under a shared vision? How can young Africans transform leadership, technology, and education into engines of renewal? And most importantly, how can Africa reclaim its voice in global governance, ensuring that its people are not passive subjects of history but active shapers of the future? At its core, Africa's path forward is a call to courage, imagination, and collective responsibility. It insists that the continent's liberation is not a distant dream, but a living possibility if Africans choose unity over division, justice over exploitation, and self-determination over subjugation. Chapter 20. Completing the unfinished business: Unity, Leadership and Liberation. Introduction. The weight of unfinished struggles. Africa's modern history is a paradox of triumph and betrayal. The continent won its political independence from colonial powers in the mid-20th century through courage, sacrifice, and blood. Yet, more than 6 decades later, the dream of full liberation remains elusive. The flags and anthems may have changed, but many of the structures of exploitation, dependency, and fragmentation remain stubbornly in place. The unfinished business of Africa is therefore not merely about reclaiming sovereignty from external forces, it is about confronting internal contradictions, dismantling neo-colonial systems, forging authentic unity, and cultivating visionary leadership that can carry the torch of liberation to completion. As Kwame Nkrumah once declared, the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of Africa. Those words remain prophetic today. Independence in name without true unity, economic sovereignty, and collective liberation is a hollow victory. Africa's unfinished business lies in ensuring that political freedom translates into material well-being, dignity, and agency for all her people. Unity, the cornerstone of Africa's future. Africa's fragmentation remains one of its greatest weaknesses. Colonial powers deliberately carved artificial borders through the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, creating states that were ethnically, linguistically, and culturally diverse but politically divided. These borders persist, often fueling conflict and mistrust among neighbors. Pan-African thinkers like Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Cheikh Anta Diop, and Frantz Fanon envisioned a united Africa, a federation that could pool its resources, protect its people, and stand tall in global affairs. Yet today, the continent still functions as a mosaic of 55 states, many pursuing narrow national interests rather than continental priorities. Unity does not mean uniformity. It is not the erasure of diversity, but the harmonization of Africa's strength into a collective force. The African Union, AU, though imperfect, represents a step in this direction. Initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, are promising beginnings, signaling a shift towards intra-African cooperation. However, true unity requires more than institutions. It demands a shared vision rooted in trust, solidarity, and the recognition that Africa's survival depends on collective strength. If we do not unite, we shall be crushed one by one. Kwame Nkrumah. Leadership, the missing link in liberation. The leadership crisis has been Africa's Achilles heel since independence. While many founding fathers dreamed of liberation, too many successors embraced corruption, authoritarianism, and clientelism. Instead of nurturing inclusive development, they often entrenched dependency on external powers. Africa's path forward requires a new generation of leaders who embody integrity, accountability, and vision. Leadership must shift from the politics of strongmen to the politics of strong institutions. This means reforming governance structures, strengthening the rule of law, and dismantling systems that perpetuate elite enrichment at the expense of the masses. Importantly, leadership is not confined to politicians alone. Intellectuals, civil society, religious leaders, and young people have a critical role to play in shaping the moral and intellectual direction of the continent. As Chinua Achebe argued in The Trouble with Nigeria, 1983, the trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership. Achebe's observation remains hauntingly true, and unless Africa resolves this leadership deficit, liberation will remain incomplete. Liberation beyond independence, redefining freedom. Liberation cannot be reduced to political independence alone. True liberation encompasses economic sovereignty, cultural renewal, technological advancement, and the ability to speak with an authentic voice in global governance. Economic liberation. Africa remains trapped in extractive economies where raw materials are exported while value addition occurs elsewhere. This dependency perpetuates poverty and underdevelopment. Completing the unfinished business means industrialization, technological investment, and creating intra-African value chains. Cultural liberation. Colonialism did not only steal Africa's resources, it also sought to erode African identity. Liberation requires a revival of indigenous knowledge systems, languages, and philosophies. Fanon, in The Wretched of the Earth, 1961, warned that decolonization must involve cultural rebirth, not mere political transfers of power. Psychological liberation. Centuries of enslavement and colonialism left scars of inferiority and dependency. To complete liberation, Africans must shed these mental chains and reclaim confidence in their capacity to chart their destiny. The youth and the unfinished business. Africa is the youngest continent in the world, with more than 60% of its population under the age of 25. This demographic reality presents both a challenge and an opportunity. If empowered, young Africans can become innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders of change. If neglected, they may become disillusioned, vulnerable to exploitation, or driven into dangerous migrations. Education reform is central to youth empowerment. The current systems, often modeled on colonial curricula, must be restructured to prioritize creativity, problem-solving, and African-centered values. Technology also offers an avenue for youth to leapfrog into the future, but only if digital divides are bridged and innovation is nurtured. The unfinished business cannot be completed without the energy, vision, and courage of Africa's youth. They are not merely the leaders of tomorrow, they are the actors of today. Reclaiming Africa's voice in global governance. For too long, Africa has been treated as a passive subject of global politics, spoken for, rather than speaking for itself. Completing the unfinished business means Africa must reclaim its agency on the world stage. This requires reforming international institutions like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, where Africa's representation remains limited despite its vast population and resources. It also means developing stronger South-South alliances, building partnerships with other regions of the Global South, and asserting African priorities in climate negotiations, trade talks, and peace-building processes. An Africa that speaks with one voice cannot be ignored. An Africa divided will always be manipulated. Unity, leadership, liberation, the threefold mandate. The themes of unity, leadership, and liberation are interconnected. Unity provides the strength, leadership provides the direction, and liberation provides the goal. Without unity, Africa remains vulnerable. Without leadership, Africa drifts. Without liberation, Africa's independence is hollow. The unfinished business is therefore not a single project but a continuous struggle, a call for Africans to embrace responsibility, courage, and vision. The continent's destiny will not be written by outsiders, it must be authored by Africans themselves. Conclusion. A call to courage. Completing the unfinished business of Africa is not an option, it is an obligation to past generations who fought for independence and to future generations who deserve a dignified life. The choice before Africa is clear: unity or fragmentation, visionary leadership or perpetual crisis, liberation or continued subjugation. As Nelson Mandela once said, "I have walked that long road to freedom. I have tried not to falter. I have made missteps along the way. But I have discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb." Africa has climbed the hill of independence. Now it must climb the greater hills of unity, leadership, and liberation. Only then will the unfinished business of freedom be complete.